Chapter 607. Before dawn it was all darkness. The fire crackled. Occasionally a few sparks would leap out and draw out a fleeting red mark in the air. These red marks were reflected in Haitang's eyes and appeared particularly strange. She stood up and looked at Fan Xian. Quietly she said, "What exactly do you want to do? Or rather, what exactly had Fan Xian done in these 3 days?" "I haven't done anything." Fan Xian's back was to her. His back appeared particularly straight. "I only want to keep you for 3 days. Haitang's pupils constricted slightly. She had been tricked by Fan Xian into coming out for 3 days. The aces in the court had followed Chief Su Bida and followed them for 3 days. Indeed, Fan Xian didn't need to do anything personally, but something must have gone wrong in the court. This woman was someone who could take things up and let them go. She glanced at Fan Xian calmly and then turned to walk toward the back of the tribe. Her footsteps were not very urgent, but her speed was very fast. Like a sprite on the grasslands, she flew 30 feet in a flash. "It's too late for you to go back." Fan Xian turned around and looked at her calmly. "You and the Northern Qi Emperor tricked me once and tricked me a few times. The Central Plain people in the court are all Northern Qi people, yet you are still tricking me. These people working in the court are dangerous people for the Qin kingdom. I have to get rid of them." Haitang stopped walking. She knew what Fan Xian said was true. If something strange had happened in the court during these 3 days, even if she rushed back now, it would be too late. The Crescent Sea is heavily guarded. Since you didn't act personally, who did it? Without waiting for Fan Xian's reply, a dark and cold image seeped into her heart. She had not forgotten that the Overwatch Council had the best assassin in the world. The chief was not in the court and all the aces were out. If that assassin acted, who could stop him? The shadow of the Overwatch Council would never miss an attack. Regardless of whether Haitang or the chief were able to stay in the court, they probably would not give the shadow any chance to act. Thinking of this, Haitang finally understood why Fan Xian had revealed himself to lure her to find him and lure the chief to follow the two of them. "Your heart is indeed becoming harder and harder." She turned around and looked at Fan Xian. She was not angry, only lonely. "Is there anyone in this world that you are not willing to use?" Fan Xian had used Haitang, but he did not feel any remorse in his heart. The two of them were already enemies. "I am not a heartless person." He then shook his arms and leapt toward her. The tyrannical Jinqi in his body bloomed to its limit in an instant, shaking the night sky and grasslands into chaos. Like a tornado it swept forward. Haitang's eyes lit up as she watched the godlike man approach her. She reached out from her thin leather robe and drew a semicircle beside her, stabilizing the flow of air around her in the time it took for a spark to fly off a flint. A moment ago, there was endless affection and sorrow at parting. In the next moment, a storm suddenly rose. Fan Xian was like a god of death under the moonlit night. Carrying the grass and sparks around him, he struck out with a fist that was like thunder. Haitang Duodua's figure flashed and disappeared in front of this storm. In the next moment she appeared in front of Fan Xian in the eye of the storm. Using her fingers as a sword, she stabbed out at an angle. It was as if she wanted to knock down the moon in the sky. The Crescent Sea reflected the moon in the sky. It was beautiful, clear, and serene. The people around the sea were sleeping deeply. Only the serving girls who had woken up early began to walk into the sea to prepare to fill the water for the nobles to wash. A serving girl looked at the hunched mute servant and smiled. She took out a piece of cake from her clothes and handed it over. This mute servant had been picked up from the grasslands by the Donghu family 4 months ago. His body was a bit handicapped, but he had great strength. Using him to do rough work was the most convenient. However, because he could not speak and was a slave, he was often bullied by the young nobles around the court. He looked very pitiful. If it weren't for these kind Hu girls helping him out daily, this mute servant probably wouldn't have lived for more than a few days. The mute servant accepted the cake the Hu girls handed him and smiled ingratiatingly. His throat made a croaking sound as if he wanted to express his thanks. The Hu girls giggled and almost broke the peace of the Crescent Sea before dawn. The mute servant walked toward the meadow behind the Crescent Sea. Every day at dawn he would go pick up sheep dung. The people in the court had long become used to this sight. Today this mute servant walked through the meadow and the dense sheep dung. His body remained hunched and he didn't even glance at the sheep dung. Usually he would be happy to run into so much sheep dung. Today he would not be happy because he no longer had to pick up sheep dung. Walking to a patch of long grass, the mute servant slowly took out an iron drill from his bosom and stabbed it into the soil. With a shake of his right palm, the iron drill that was stained with blood was shaken several feet into the soil with a poochie sound. Not a single trace of it could be found. The mute servant pressed his dry lips together and closed his eyes to think back to the process of his actions. After confirming he had not missed anything, he once again raised his feet. His body was still hunched as he slowly walked into the depths of the grasslands. No one knew how long it would take before he could walk back to the central plain. The surroundings of the Crescent Sea were calm. No one noticed that a mute servant had left the place he had lived in for 4 months. The security around the king's tent appeared tight, but in reality, it appeared lifeless, particularly the people from the central plain who the chief placed great importance on. The important figures responsible for communicating with Qingzhou and Dingzhou lived in tents that were particularly deathly silent. Wei Wuqing's body was weak. He couldn't speak at all. He couldn't even move a finger. However, his teeth chattered endlessly and made a rattling sound. He looked at the dead people around him and felt a chill rise from the depths of his heart. He was responsible for the court's accounts and trade. He knew that the colleagues around him were all powerful figures from the Qi kingdom. If these people hadn't helped the chief, the power on the grasslands would not have been able to fight the Iron Riders of the Qing kingdom in the past year or so and reap so many benefits from it. However, these people had all died. Only he had survived. He thought of the scene earlier. Terror rose in his heart. It made him want to scream, but he couldn't make a sound. The shadow, the god of death, had controlled him like a ghost and then easily and slowly massacred everyone in the tent. No one made a sound or had any reaction. Wei Wuqing didn't know who that person was or why he hadn't killed him. Chatting could preserve his life. This was a benefit no one could think of. He only sank into endless terror. His pupils constricted nervously. He felt that this patch of darkness would never be able to turn into light. One finger picked up the moon. The fingertip was slender and ordinary, but it seemed to contain the brilliance of heaven and earth. In an instant, it broke through the wind and intent and lifted toward Fan Xian's throat. His fist had already struck empty air. It brushed past Haitang's right shoulder and crashed into the grasslands, sending up a large cloud of dirt and grass. Borrowing the power of heaven and earth to do things naturally, no school was more powerful than Qiani Dao. The shadow of the moon gradually disappeared. The view on the grasslands was blurry. With Haitang's sliding step and attack, it was as if she could sense every wisp of wind and every grain of grass on the grasslands. She moved gracefully toward Fan Xian. Fan Xian had learned the heart of Qiani Dao from this girl's family. When it came to the cultivation of borrowing power, he was far from Haitang's match. His eyes narrowed. With a flick of his left finger, a small knife spun 2 rounds on his fingertip. It left the sheath. A cold light flashed, beheading moon, chopped towards the fingertip a few inches away from his throat. Given their cultivation realms, regardless of whether it was a finger or a movement, as long as it touched the other person's body and Jinqi entered through the bridge, it would heavily injure the other person. Thus, Fan Xian had to stop the finger that was too light to the point of being unable to catch a trace. In order to hide his identity, he did not have a sleeve crossbow on him. There was no black dagger in his boots. Where did this knife come from? The small knife light was about to chop Haitang's finger. In this moment, everything seemed to slow down. The little knife could be seen clearly. It was the gift Haitang had given to the young master of Fan Xian's family earlier. Haitang's eyes grew brighter and brighter. This brightness carried an indescribable feeling. Her finger did not pull back and did not respond at all. It continued to point toward Fan Xian's throat as if she did not see the knife. Fan Xian sighed in his heart. His left hand relaxed slightly, and the knife light immediately retracted. Unexpectedly, he did not care about Haitang's finger pointing toward his throat. Instead, he slammed it down toward Haitang's chest. Fan Xian pulled back his knife, Haitang pulled back her finger, Fan Xian brought down his palm, and Haitang returned to protect. These were 4 simple movements, but they had to be done so cleanly and without any hesitation. In this world, probably only when these 2 young people faced each other could there be such a miraculous scene. In the end, Fan Xian had the first move. His palm had already landed on Haitang's chest. Haitang's eyes grew brighter and brighter. She did not pay any attention to this palm. Instead, her fingers spread out gently like the autumn grass floating in the night wind on the grasslands. Strand by strand, they wrapped around Fan Xian's arm and restrained his right arm. In a flash, Fan Xian and Haitang Duo each had a chance to kill the other. This opportunity had even been purposely left by the other, but neither of them could act. This was the first time the 2 of them had met by the North Sea. After Fan Xian had used aphrodisiac and poetry to move her soul, and Haitang had responded with light, it was the continuation of the battle of hearts between the 2 major figures of the younger generation of Northern Qi and the Qing kingdom that had lasted for years. It looked like he had moved his hand, but in reality he had moved his heart. Haitang gambled that Fan Xian's knife aimed at her finger would not go down, and Fan Xian abandoned his knife. Fan Xian gambled that Haitang's finger aimed at his throat would not go down, and Haitang pulled back her finger. Haitang gambled that Fan Xian's palm aimed at her chest would not go down, and so she bound his right arm. If they both couldn't bear it, why act? There was a strange smile on Fan Xian's face as he looked at Haitang in front of him. Although the two of them knew that this attack would probably be futile in the end, he still acted. Haitang placed her hand on his finger and spat out the pure Jinqi of Tianyi Dao, stopping the tyrannical Jinqi in Fan Xian's right arm from charging forward. It immediately made the palm he had imprinted on her chest useless. Fan Xian still acted. There was no threat or Jinqi. He moved around Haitang's clothes. The place where his palm pressed was very wonderful, very soft and very gentle. Thus this move was very enchanting. Haitang was very angry, and her heart was slightly in chaos. Fan Xian's left hand, which had abandoned his knife, quietly brushed up in the instant her heart was slightly in chaos. It brushed against the side of Haitang's ear. With a gentle flick of his little finger, a golden needle pierced into the pressure point below Haitang's ear. He wanted to kidnap Haitang and bring her back to the central plane. He wanted the trap coup he had set to stop tormenting this pitiful girl's state of mind. Thus, he thought long and hard and was willing to take the risk to capture her. Was this needle? The pride of a generation, the northern Qi Saint girl Haitang Duo had finally lost. She had lost to Fan Xian on this quiet grassland. In the 4th year of the Qing calendar, Haitang Duo had emerged from the mountains. She had fought dozens of battles, large and small, and had never tasted defeat. Her reputation flourished until an immortal poet and a young ace appeared in the Qing kingdom. From then on, the people of the world discussed fervently if Haitang Duo met Fan Xian, who would win. On the shore of the North Sea, Haitang had first met Fan Xian. At that time, Fan Xian was not a match for Haitang at all. He had only relied on the footwork Uncle Wu Zhu had personally taught him to barely dodge. Using poisonous needles and poisonous smoke, he had held on the meadow. Fan Xian had not lost. Relying on his shamelessness and ruthlessness, he had successfully forced Haitang back. Did they remember that the North Sea was full of spring? After that, Haitang and Fan Xian had never truly exchanged blows. Both of them knew that if it was just a contest of martial arts, Fan Xian was no match for Haitang. However, if it was a life-and-death battle, given Fan Xian's ruthlessness, even if Haitang could kill Fan Xian, she would probably have to pay a great price. After that, the two of them became friends. The entire world began to sing about this scandal. Everyone knew that it was impossible for the two of them to fight. Some people couldn't help but feel disappointed. If these disappointed people knew what had happened on the grasslands, they would certainly be very excited. Haitang Duo had finally lost to Sir Fan Jr. More accurately, she had lost to Fan Xian's even more shameless and sinister nature. The golden needle trembled under Haitang's glistening ear. Fan Xian's fingers gently pinched the needle. His expression was very serious. He endlessly used this thin needle to pour Jinqi into Haitang's meridians. His right hand had long broken free of Haitang's control. It pressed swiftly on the girl's body. He had to completely control her. In Jiangnan, the injuries in his body had been healed by Tianyi Dao's Jinqi. Fan Xian knew better than anyone the recovery power of Tianyi Dao's Jinqi. The golden needle pressing into a meridian point could only make Haitang's body freeze for a moment. To truly control her and not harm her, he could only use his tyrannical Jinqi to forcefully seal the meridians in her body. However, Fan Xian's fingers, which carried a strong wind, gradually slowed. His gaze was very serious and even carried a glimmer of sorrow. Finally he stopped his fingers. His left hand also slowly left the golden needle. With a crisp crack, the golden needle under Haitang's ear broke inch by inch. Such a thin and soft golden needle pressed into an important meridian point under her ear was broken by the Jinqi in her body. What a powerful rebound. With a Haitang spat out a mouthful of fresh blood. Her face immediately paled, but her eyes remained bright. She calmly looked at the sorrowful Fan Xian in front of her. Wiping the blood from the corner of her mouth, she said, "I've already injured my internal organs. I'm not a match for you. You can try to keep me here." Fan Xian was silent. He knew what had happened in Haitang's body earlier. When he had used his tyrannical Jinqi to forcefully seal her meridians, the pure Tianyi Dao Jinqi in Haitang's body had begun to counterattack. It counterattacked without regard for its own life and death, forcefully attacking every spot where his fingers had landed. If Fan Xian had forcefully continued, at most he would have used up a great deal of Jinqi and still been able to control Haitang. However, Haitang's decisive Jinqi flowing in the opposite direction would cause her meridians to explode and make her a useless person. After a moment of silence, Fan Xian lowered his head and sadly said, "Even if you die, you still won't come with me?" Haitang looked at him calmly. Fresh blood dripped from the corner of her lips. Slowly she said, "If my heart wasn't in chaos, how could you control me? If your heart wasn't in chaos, how could you let go of a great opportunity to capture me in one move and throw Shi Lake into chaos? I don't want to die, but I know you won't let me die." Fan Xian was silent for a moment and then said, "Thank you." He was thanking Haitang for her trust in him. He was thanking her for knowing his heart and his feelings. Although the two of them had never said it explicitly, they had long known each other. It was like the night on the grasslands or the moon at the edge of the night line, clear and difficult to forget. After giving his thanks, Fan Xian looked at Haitang and said each word clearly, "Do you really want to stay in Shi Lake and become my enemy on the battlefield? I have my perseverance and you have yours, no?" A strange light bloomed on Haitang's ordinary face. There was 20% stubbornness, 30% confidence and 50% perseverance. Fan Xian gritted his teeth and said angrily in a low voice, "This is Ku He's arrangement. What kind of person are you? Why should you obediently listen to his arrangements?" This was what Fan Xian was most angry about. What he hated the most in this life was having his life controlled by those terrifying old creatures. He firmly believed that his life would be free. This was something more important than the grasslands or northern Qi. Haitang looked at him calmly like she was looking at a child. "If I listen to you and leave the grasslands, won't I also listen to your arrangements?" Fan Xian was startled. He knew what she meant. The grasslands cannot fall into chaos. I have to stay. Haitang looked at him and said, "I don't know what you've done these 3 days. Perhaps I won't be able to stop you in time, but I have to think of a way to stop the chaos on the grasslands." Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He then shook his head and said, "Like a prairie fire, who can stop it?" Haitang looked at him. Fan Xian smiled bitterly and said, "Last night, the left virtuous prince should have been assassinated." Shock flashed through Haitang's eyes. She had been on the grasslands for 2 years. She knew what kind of turmoil the left virtuous prince's death would bring. If Fan Xian had purposely left some traces when he acted, the grasslands, which had just been peaceful for a year, would probably sink back into the endless flames of war because of revenge and the struggle for power. "How could you kill him?" Haitang stared into Fan Xian's eyes and bit her lower lip. The left and right virtuous princes had great power on the grasslands. Chief Su Bida had the support of Haitang, Northern Qi, and tens of thousands of riders from the northern tribes to barely suppress the two virtuous princes. During these 2 years, the left and right virtuous princes had always been wary of the court. Their defenses were powerful. Haitang furrowed her brows slightly. She could not think of anyone in the Qin kingdom who could sneak into the depths of the grasslands and assassinate the left virtuous prince. Perhaps the shadow of the Overwatch Council had such power, but he should have gone to the court to deal with Northern Qi's support for the grasslands court. The rushing sound of horse hooves came faintly from the distance. It looked like the riders of the court chasing Fan Xian could no longer hold back. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and glanced in that direction. In a quiet voice he said, "I said 3 days ago that regardless of whether it is Ku He or the little emperor of Northern Qi, they do not trust me. This has always been a great mistake. Regardless of how the world moves in the future, I must take the initiative in dealing with these matters into my own hands because I have more power than all of you." He gazed at Haitang and said, 13th Wang followed the merchant group into the grasslands. When I stayed behind to wait for you, he followed the left virtuous prince's subordinates back from the court. I believe in his courage and power. If even the fiercest warrior in the world cannot kill the left virtuous prince, then I can only say that my luck is not good. Come back with me. Haitang was silent. Fan Xian shook his head self-mockingly and helplessly. He then whistled toward the endless darkness behind him. The sound of hooves gradually rang out in the depths of the grasslands, like a herd of wild horses running freely. Chapter 608. A smear of white appeared on the horizon. The sun was still rubbing his eyes and did not open them. The faint morning light enveloped the grasslands but did not brighten people's vision. After last night's revelry, the people of the small tribe were still drunk and sleepy. They should not have felt the call of the morning sun. Gradually, a faint sound rang out from the tribe's curtains. It seemed that many people had woken up. What woke the people of the tribe was not the rising sun. Rather, it was the thunderous roar of orderly horse hooves from behind the tribe, as well as a mass of chaotic horse hooves in front of the tribe. From all directions, it seemed that countless riders were closing in. In the morning light, Fan Xian's expression was calm. He glanced at Haitang one last time and picked up the knife she had given to Yoshiko from beside his feet. Solemnly he put it into his clothes. "Goodbye. I hope I don't have to wait another 3 years," Fan Xian said seriously to Haitang. There were a few streaks of blood at the side of Haitang's lips. She looked very pitiful, but the arrangements on the grasslands had already begun to move. The chief of the court had already sent troops to catch up. If she wanted to escape, she could only take advantage of this moment to leave. Haitang didn't know how he was going to leave because the sound of horse hooves came from all directions. It seemed that the court's riders had already surrounded the grasslands. She glanced at him with a complicated gaze. This gaze was like a heavy hammer that struck Fan Xian's body. It made his body drift diagonally toward the meadow behind him. He drifted easily and joyfully, but it was also gloomy and enchanting. He didn't see how his toes pushed against the ground, but it was as if a thin rope had been tied around his waist. Like a kite, Fan Xian drifted backward and gradually increased in speed. He became a blurry figure in the morning light, gradually moving further and further away. He gradually became smaller and merged into a large cloud of dust coming from the tribe's front left. The cloud of dust looked like a herd of free wild horses running amok on the grasslands. Beside the herd of horses, there were a dozen grassland men holding lassos. It was as if they had followed this herd of wild horses for a number of days and nights, waiting to catch the leader in one fell swoop. Haitang watched this scene calmly. She knew that this herd of wild horses was just an illusion. It must have been a group Fan Xian had arranged to receive her. Seeing Fan Xian float away without stirring up any dust, she knew that after not seeing him for 3 years, her young friend from the southern court had already successfully merged the heart of Tianidao with the tyrannical Jinqi in his body. He stood firmly at the peak of the 9th level and was about to touch the limits of humans. No wonder he was so confident that he dared to enter the grasslands and launch an attack on the royal court and the left virtuous prince's tent in the dark. With such a realm, unless a great grandmaster reappeared on the grasslands who could defeat him. Chief Subida had endured for 3 days and had reached his limit. At this moment he had finally closed the encirclement. Even if Fan Xian had arranged for a group of horses to receive him, could he escape the pursuit of thousands of court riders on the vast grasslands? Haitang's eyes narrowed. A glimmer of worry rose in her heart. If a 9th level ace faced an enemy head-on, it would be difficult for them to lose. After all, the two of them were still an immeasurable distance away from the realm of a great grandmaster. If they were to face thousands of soldiers and horses, how could they survive? In the distance, Fan Xian's figure had already landed among the wild horses. Strangely, the wild and free-loving wild horses, which looked like they would not settle down, did not reject Fan Xian's entry. When Fan Xian sat on the leading horse, the vicious leading horse only shook its neck helplessly. It did not think of throwing him off. The hurried sound of horse hooves swept past Haitang's side. It carried the sound of the wind, grass, and an indomitable aura. The valiant riders of the Western Hu court did not slow down at all. They swept across the meadow toward the wild horse herd in the distance. The wind swept past her body, causing the leather robe on Haitang's body to flutter. She wiped away the blood at the side of her lips and lowered her head silently. A fine horse neighed and stopped from its extraordinary speed. The Hu tribe noble on the horse used the inertia to turn and rise. With a thud, he landed beside Haitang. His feet were as steady as a mountain, revealing his exquisite riding skills. The person who had come was the master of the grasslands, Chief Subida. He glanced at Haitang. Anger and embarrassment gradually rose in his eyes. Injured? Haitang nodded and smiled with some difficulty. The Qing Kingdom's Fan Xian? Chief Subida was tall. His features were firm and the light in his eyes shone. He looked in the distance at the figure galloping southeast with the wild horse herd and asked in a quiet voice. "It's him," Haitang replied quietly. Chief Subida would never underestimate any of his enemies, particularly a ruthless and important figure like the Qing Kingdom's Fan Xian. He had endured for 3 days. In reality he had prepared for 3 days. He had gathered the Hu tribe soldiers on this grasslands. He had to keep this powerful Qing official on the grasslands. Since the other party dared to enter deep into the grasslands, get close to the court and challenge his dignity, Chief Subida would use the most direct method to express his anger. The court had made ample preparations. After confirming that there were no Qing riders patrolling the grasslands, they prepared to receive Fan Xian in secret. However, the spies had not noticed the herd of wild horses. Wild horse herds could be seen everywhere on the grasslands. Most importantly, they had once seen these wild horses beside a patch of water grass. From their jumping posture and habits, they determined that this was indeed a herd of wild horses. No one could use wild horses to escape before taming them. This was a rule on the grasslands. It seemed that this rule was about to be broken by someone. Smoke and dust rose in all directions. Over 1,000 court riders charged over and charged past the tribe's tents. Under the shocked and terrified gazes of the Hu tribe people, they charged toward the herd of wild horses. It looked like they were about to surround the herd of horses, the dozen men beside them and Fan Xian who was hidden in the herd of wild horses, but a long neigh rose into the sky. The herd of wild horses seemed to be driven by some kind of power. Immediately they were startled awake from the chaos. Stretching out the muscles on their bodies, they raised their hooves and abruptly increased their speed, charging toward the gap in the southeast of the encirclement. The morning sun shone brightly and the wild horses neighed. Hundreds of fine horses reflected the weak light and emitted a dark complexion as they galloped on the grasslands. In just a moment, they had already rushed out of the encirclement of the court cavalry. This scene had a primitive beauty that was filled with power, and it shocked the minds of countless people. Chief Su Bida held the reins in one hand and stood by Haitang's side. Coldly he watched this scene. His eyes narrowed slightly, but he hid the shock in his heart very well. With a flip of his body, he leaped onto the fine horse and said, "I'll bring this pretty boy back for you to vent your anger." At this time he had already admitted that this young powerful official of the southern court, who could be mentioned in the same breath as Songji Xianling, was not just a pretty boy. Looking at his miraculous ability to control wild horses, there was probably not a second person like him on the grasslands. Last night the court was attacked. The left virtuous prince was assassinated. No one knows if he is dead or alive. Haitang stood on the meadow among the chief's dozens of guards. Calmly she spoke of what Fan Xian had admitted. The chief held the reins with both hands and paused slightly. Immediately after, he squeezed the horse's belly and charged down the meadow. So, the commissioner of the Qing Kingdom's Overwatch Council had entered deep into the grasslands for this matter. The attack on the court was a small matter. As long as it was not the elite riders of the Qing Kingdom charging over, what did it matter if some people died? The chief had not thought that the Qing Kingdom's Overwatch Council was also very selective in who they killed. The people who died were very important to his dream of building a country on the grasslands. Most importantly, the left virtuous prince had been assassinated. This news chilled the chief's heart. Was the grasslands, which had been peaceful for 2 years, going to sink back into chaos because of the left virtuous prince's death? Thinking of this, he couldn't help but curse silently. The left virtuous prince was his uncle. Back then he had been incomparably arrogant in front of him. Who knew that he would be killed by a Qing assassin with one blow? He was truly a bastard. The chief looked angrily at the dust in the distance. Squeezing the horse's belly, he charged toward the southeast first. Although the pretty boy had used the wild horse herd as a cover and unexpectedly killed his way out of the encirclement, the chief believed that no one would be able to escape the pursuit of the court's riders on the vast grasslands. From here to Qingzhou on the border of the Qing Kingdom, even if one spared no effort and galloped to their heart's content, it would still take 10 days. Galloping madly on the grasslands for 10 days with the Western Hu court's riders chasing after them, who could stand against that? The chief was riding a 1,000-li horse, one out of tens of thousands. He believed he could stop Fan Xian. Although the Qing Kingdom's cavalry and archery were also very powerful, the people of the grasslands still believed that the Western Hu men's riding skills were still the most exquisite. If they couldn't catch up to an enemy they could see on the grasslands, they might as well commit suicide. The morning light gradually brightened, and the sight between heaven and earth gradually brightened. The warped morning sun peeked out halfway from the eastern horizon of the grasslands and lit up everything on the autumn plains. Haitang looked calmly at everything in front of her. A glimmer of worry and sadness flashed through her eyes. She saw that on the grasslands the flood-like Western Hu riders had not formed an encirclement. Relying on the Hu people's exquisite riding skills, they quickly formed a group and formed a fan. Thousands of riders were like one as they sped toward the east. 2 to 3 li in front of the pursuing Hu riders, hundreds of black wild horses were galloping madly. Their hooves kicked up dust. They were like wisps of smoke as they headed east toward the red morning sun. Suddenly, a few people leaped out of the herd of wild horses and mounted them. No one knew where these people had been hiding earlier or how they were able to follow the wild horses forward. 100 Qing men rode on hundreds of wild horses and galloped through the grasslands ruled by the Hu people. Before the red sun, the horses and the figures on them appeared very spirited and arrogant. The Western Hu soldiers had made a major mistake in their judgment. They had thought that when it came to riding skills, the court riders were unparalleled in the world. No one could compare to them. Furthermore, they didn't know how the Qing people controlled the herd of wild horses. Although the wild horses were powerful, they were not as obedient and durable as war horses. Thus, they thought that on this expansive grasslands, they would need at most half a day's time to catch up to the Qing people galloping toward the sun. Chief Subida also thought this way. He was even thinking about whether or not he should first kill the powerful Qing official called Fan Xian with arrows after he surrounded the Qing people and not give Princess Songji any chance to plead for mercy. However, everything developed differently from the judgment of the Western Hu court riders. Half a day passed. A day passed. The proud knights of the grasslands were still unable to catch up to the Qing people. They couldn't even close the distance. The reason was simple. The wild horses in the eyes of the Hu people were not wild horses at all. They were military horses that the Qing Overwatch Council had raised for a long time. The reason they could hide from the eyes of countless people on the grasslands, from the tribes famous for their horses, and become a herd of wild horses that wandered among the water and grass was all because they had been drugged. A drug mixed with ephedrine made the Overwatch Council's military horses appear more active, wilder and free-spirited than normal horses. Furthermore, this herd of horses was very careful. They had not been nailed or branded. Even their manes had not been tidied. Once they galloped, there was the feeling of their long hair floating in the wind. No matter who saw them, they would think they were a herd of wild horses. That was why, that night, under the watchful eyes of the court riders, they had quietly approached Fan Xian. Fan Xian held the reins with one hand and lowered his head to the horse, carefully feeling the condition of the horse. There were 100 subordinates receiving him. Other than a dozen elites disguised as men on horses, the rest of the people had relied on their superb riding skills to hide among the herd of horses. They had experimented many times. The effect of the ephedrine on horses was not as great on humans as it was on horses. It was not to the extent that these war horses would not listen to orders. For the pursuing soldiers of the court, the speed of these horses galloping was terrifying. War horses disguised as wild horses were still war horses, much less war horses that had taken stimulants. Fan Xian knew that the stimulants would not last long, but he didn't need too long. 100 people took turns riding hundreds of horses, giving the war horses enough time to rest and recover. If they still let the people of the chief's court catch up, Fan Xian might as well cut his own neck and be done with it. A good horse needed someone to ride it. This was the second mistake the pursuing soldiers made in their judgment. They always thought that no one in the world had better riding skills than them and was more valiant in long-range attacks. They had forgotten a name. The Black Knights. The Qing Kingdom's riders had always been powerful. Other than armor and protective gear, they were not much weaker than the riders of the Western Hu. The Black Knights were the elite of the Qing Kingdom's riders. Under Qin Pingping's careful selection and training, the quality of the individual soldiers was truly shocking. In particular, the Black Knights had the most illustrious battle history in the world when it came to long-distance attacks that the Western Hu people were so proud of. Back then, the Qing Kingdom had suffered a crushing defeat on the northern expedition. The Qing Emperor had been trapped in barren mountains and unruly rivers. Qin Pingping had heard the news and led the Black Knights to rescue him. Within 6 days they had advanced 1,000 li on the battlefield and saved the Qing Emperor, who was still the crown prince at the time. Another year, Qin Pingping personally led the Black Knights deep into the territory of the Wei Kingdom and captured the ambitious and ruthless Xiaoan alive. Before the Wei Kingdom's military could react, they retreated like lightning back into the territory of the Kingdom of Qing. In and out, they traveled thousands of li over mountains and rivers. History had long proven that the Black Knight's ability to launch a 1,000 li surprise attack was the strongest in the world. The Overwatch Council's Black Knights were famous for their 1,000 li surprise attacks. After they became a system, they practiced this kind of situation most often. They put a lot of effort into maintaining the medicinal strength of the war horses. They advanced like fire and wind and retreated like water and clouds. In a flash, they disappeared from the battlefield. Advance was the best in the world. Quick retreat was also the best in the world. How could the elite riders of the Western Hu court catch up to this group of sudden assassins that moved like birds? The autumn wind on the grasslands hit Fan Xian's face. He narrowed his eyes and glanced at Jinggu beside him. Looking at the silver mask on his face, he couldn't help but smile. If he didn't have absolute confidence in his subordinates, how could he take such a risk and enter deep into the grasslands court, the heart of Shihu, draw out the chief of Haitang and lay down those 2 big bombs? On the third day of the chase, the riders of the court finally discovered something strange. They had not slowed down at all. The grassland horses beneath them were already exhausted, but they still could not catch up. Furthermore, the daring Qing people who had entered deep into the grasslands seemed to still have energy to spare. It was as if they could let their horses go at any moment. They were only forcefully suppressing their speed to lure the riders of the court behind them. Hearing the Dandan's alert and tired report, a glimmer of coldness flashed across Chief Subita's travel-stained face. He was actually the first person to discover the problem. He could feel that there was something wrong with the group of strange and even magical wild horses in front of him. Although the court's eagles were circling above, there were no large tribes on the grasslands toward Qingzhou that could stop them. The chief could not do anything. The news of the left virtuous prince's assassination had already been confirmed. The chief knew what he should do. Once the entire grasslands learned of this news, they would turn their suspicious gazes toward him or the right virtuous prince. The men under the left virtuous prince's tent would certainly already be clamoring for revenge for the left virtuous prince. In order to stabilize the court's position, Chief Subita should immediately pull on the reins and return to give the left virtuous prince an explanation. The longer he left, the more suspicious the left virtuous prince's tent would become of him. Chief Subita was not afraid of the revenge of the left virtuous prince's subordinates. If he wanted to become the true ruler of the grasslands, he had to prevent bloody internal strife from happening. He believed in Princess Songji's words. Establishing a country on the grasslands could not only rely on blood and iron killing to succeed. However, he was not satisfied. The speed of the horse under the chief slowed down. Looking into the distance, the herd of wild horses that seemed to never feel tired, he sighed in the depths of his heart. He was unusually dissatisfied. All of the court riders stopped and turned their gazes toward the great chief. They didn't know what to do next. Should they continue this futile chase or go back? They all knew that the grasslands seemed to be a bit chaotic. If they just went back like this and watched as the Qing people came to the grasslands to strut around, they were truly dissatisfied. Chief Subita was also dissatisfied. As the master of the grasslands, sometimes he had to suppress the anger in his heart and choose the most correct path from the perspective of profit. He waved his hand gloomily, indicating for the court riders to turn their horses around and prepare to return to the court. At this moment, a burning anger suddenly rose in his eyes. The moment the Western Hu riders stopped their pursuit, the deserters in front of them also stopped. They stopped on the shallow meadow and looked back as if they were waiting for them. What kind of humiliation was this? The chief gritted his teeth and narrowed his eyes. A moment later, the expression on his face relaxed. Coldly he said, "Go back. They won't fall for it." Jinggu glanced at the commissioner, whose head was covered in sand, and said, "Looks like they won't chase any more." Fan Xian spat out the sand in his mouth and furrowed his brows. His mood relaxed slightly. The situation at hand appeared to be easy for him and the deserters. Only they who were being chased could feel the terror of the Hu riders. The elite riders of the Western Hu court truly gave the Black Knights a great deal of pressure. Just in terms of speed, the Western Hu riders were indeed the most powerful in the world. They were far more powerful than the riders of the Wei Kingdom in the past. The Black Knights appeared to be running freely, but in reality they were in a sorry state. If the court riders could hold out for another 2 days and wait for the medicinal power of the Black Knights' warhorses to gradually wear off, Fan Xian would probably be in deep trouble. The reason Fan Xian had not had the Black Knights run wildly was because he wanted to put on a confident appearance and strike at the confidence of the chief's court riders. Looking at it now, this plan seemed to be working. Furthermore, Fan Xian knew that a person as ambitious as the Western Hu chief would not let anger get to his head and only care about chasing him. He would not care about the chaos in the court or the uprising on the grasslands that the left virtuous prince could cause. A few li behind them, the court riders gradually organized and retreated. Chief Subita fell at the very back. The setting sun shone on the light armor on his body and reflected a faint light. He still looked as cold as ever. Fan Xian spat out the last bit of sand in his mouth and said, "Presumably, I left a deep impression on him this time. When we fight again on the grasslands, he will certainly not carelessly fight in the open. Scaring him off is good." Jinggu glanced at him and said, "However, the Crown Prince has set up an ambush at the mouth of Hong Mountain for a dozen days and still hasn't seen the chief arrive. I'm afraid he will be disappointed. Please, this is the master of the grasslands." Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and looked at the figure of the chief standing alone on the grasslands in the distance. He grinned and said, "How could he be so easily killed by my schemes? Some people suggested pushing down Haitang and taking her home, thus solving half of the Western Hu problem. However, it did not seem very good. The 10,000 iron riders that the Kaurna court could influence were still on the grasslands. Fan Xian could not take them back to the Qing kingdom. Most importantly, if Fan Xian dared to force his way through, he would probably spend the rest of his life being hacked at by Haitang with a knife, shivering, and being hacked at by a top ace every day. This kind of life was truly terrifying. Frankly speaking, if she was not willing, Fan Xian would not do it. Basic respect was still necessary. Chapter 609. The two sides were separated by a great distance, but they could clearly see each other's expressions. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and confirmed the other party had left. He couldn't help but shake his head. A wave of exhaustion that was difficult to suppress surged into his heart. After being chased by the Western Hu pack of wolves for 3 days, both sides had exhausted themselves. Since the other party had given up, he would not feel any disappointment. There was only relief. After waiting for 3 days, the pursuit that had been going on for 3 days seemed more like a child's game. It was not very dangerous, and neither side had even pulled out their knives or shot an arrow. But in reality, both sides knew what this pursuit represented and what kind of danger it hid. Fan Xian and his group entered deep into the grasslands and confidently left. Although they had not truly fought, they had left a deep shadow in the hearts of the Western Hu people. Many years ago, the Qing Kingdom's largest border expansion operation had also been carried out under the secret leadership of the Overwatch Council. Even now, the person called Qin Pingping was still a legend on the grasslands who was treated like a demon. Fan Xian's trip to Western Hu could be considered to have continued the Overwatch Council's excellent tradition. After taking over, he arrogantly patrolled the territory. This was a heavy blow to the spirits of the people on the grasslands. The Western Hu court wanted to unify the grasslands and fight against the Qing kingdom, but they could not keep a group of people deep in the grasslands. Presumably, this would allow them to have a clearer understanding of their own strength. It would also make the Western Hu tribe, which had been incomparably glorious these 2 years, more careful when sending out troops. Chief Su Bida had chased for 3 days in vain and was forced to turn back gloomily. He looked helpless and sorrowful, but in Fan Xian's eyes, there was a different meaning. This master of the grasslands had retreated so resolutely. This kind of courage to give up and being able to suppress the Hu riders' warlike nature was truly an oddity on the grasslands. If this person with Haitang's help truly unified the grasslands, he would probably become a great danger to the Qing kingdom. Fan Xian blinked his eyes. His long eyelashes were covered in dust. He looked like a native toying with the warriors of the grasslands in the palm of his hand. However, he was not very happy. On the contrary, he appeared lonely and helpless. "Let's go." He pulled on the reins and rode toward the bottom of the meadow under the setting sun. The warhorse beneath him was jubilant. Although it looked like the pursuing soldiers of the court had retreated, the Black Knight still did not relax. Who knew whether or not the ruthless Western Hu people would create a false impression and then attack from the side and rear? On the grasslands, the Hu people had the help of eagles. It completely nullified the effectiveness of the circular telescope in Fan Xian's hand. Because of this, the group of people who had escaped from the grasslands still did not dare to slow down. They forcefully supported their exhausted bodies and urged their war horses, which were soaked in medicinal sweat, to gallop towards the east. It was not until 7 days later that the group entered the entrance of Hong Mountain that they were truly relieved. Red Mountain was a very strange terrain in the eastern part of the grassland. It was formed by natural piles of earth and stone. After thousands of years of north wind, it had been cut into isolated mountain peaks. The mountain peaks were all crimson red. They looked as shocking and murderous as the imperial calligraphy in the imperial study. The path to enter the pass was at the bottom of these red mountains. It was a winding path that resembled sheep intestines. Fan Xian walked at the front of the group and accepted the leather pouch Jingge handed him. He drank a mouthful of water to moisten his sore throat. In a raspy voice he said, "After finishing things here, I'll have to lie in bed for 2 months when I return to the capital." A rustling sound came from the red mountain. It seemed that someone had stepped on the sand and stones on the mountain. Jingge couldn't help furrowing his brows. Fan Xian knew what he was thinking and laughed loudly. However, because of his throat, the laughter was particularly unpleasant to hear. The Qing Kingdom's Western Expedition Army lying in ambush at the mouth of Hong Mountain looked extremely tired to have allowed their group to catch such an obvious sound. The sound of horse hooves rang out from the valley ahead. The dust-covered Crown Prince Li Hongqing led the Dingzhou army over to welcome them. Li Hongqing squeezed his horse's belly and came to Fan Xian's side. Looking at Fan Xian's wretched appearance, he couldn't resist shaking his head and said, "I told you long ago, Su Bida is an ambitious and ruthless figure. How could he be tricked by you? Fan Xian glanced at him and said, at least I brought him out for 6 days. These 6 days are enough to do some things. Is there a need to be so careful just to kill the northern Qi people in the court? Li Hongqing glanced at him disapprovingly. After confirming that the kid was unharmed, he relaxed and continued, did you fight with the Western Hu people? No, I just moved my feet. The two groups met together. Their power immediately increased. In a moment they had left the mouth of Hong Mountain, which contained thousands of years of wind and sand. In order to hide the news and prevent anyone from reporting it to the Western Hu court, there were 8,000 Qing elite soldiers lying in ambush at the mouth of Hong Mountain. They were all close relatives of the general's manor, as well as frontline soldiers in Qingzhou. They had not gone through Dingzhou to make any large movements. We've waited here for 7 days and haven't seen anything. Shouldn't the Overwatch Council give us an explanation? Li Hongqing pressed his blistered lips together. Forget it. Fan Xian gently squeezed his horse's belly. There wasn't a spot on his body that wasn't sore. He glared at him and thought to himself that the ambush at the mouth of Hong Mountain was just a preparation. Who could say for sure how strong the chief's jealousy was? Furthermore, this place was still a few days away from Qingzhou. Instead of rushing back, they were still arguing endlessly. It was truly a very risky thing to do. What he was concerned about was the situation inside Dingzhou. Have they acted? I left before they acted. The governor's manor is cooperating with your subordinates. I've given military orders, so don't worry, Li Hongqing looked at him and said. Although I don't know the specifics, there have been reports coming in over the past few days. The operation should be going smoothly. The northern Qi spies in Dingzhou have basically all been pulled out by your subordinates. Fan Xian nodded and didn't say anything more. After this battle, the grasslands once again sank into chaos. Most importantly, one Overwatch Council had entered the grasslands while the other was scattered in Shiliang Road. They had successfully wiped out all of the spies the northern Qi Emperor had buried on this vast battlefield. The ruthless methods coup he had used before his death, the excellent situation that the northern Qi Emperor in Haitang had used 2 years to construct, had turned into a bubble because of his even more ruthless and shameless response. 4 days later, nearly 10,000 of the Qing elite troops finally withdrew from the grasslands and entered Qingzhou. This group of soldiers had not fought a single battle with the Western Hu riders. They had completely served as the backdrop for the Overwatch Council's actions. Their morale was not as high as when they had set out. Additionally, they had endured for too long at the mouth of Hong Mountain. They looked like defeated soldiers. The mental state of the Black Knights of the Overwatch Council was not much better. If it were not for the fact that they wanted to give Fan Xian face, these people would probably immediately fall to the ground and fall asleep. Once they entered Qingzhou, Fan Xian immediately ordered the Black Knights to rest. Jinggu accepted the order and left. However, they could not immediately bathe and eat. First, they had to take good care of the hundreds of horses specially trained by the Overwatch Council. The medicinal power in these horses' bodies had already begun to recede. They could not hold out much longer. If they were not quickly treated, they would probably gradually die. These hundreds of human-like military horses were the saviors of the Overwatch Council's Black Knights. No one wanted to see them finally fall into such a tragic state. However, everyone knew that after this 1,000-li run, this group of black horses would never be able to recover their original spirit. Inevitably, they felt a bit sad in their hearts. Fan Xian followed the army of the western camp and met the suspicious gazes from both sides of the road in Qingzhou. The soldiers and merchants had guessed this young man's identity. They also guessed that the court must have carried out a major operation on the grasslands. Looking at the tired and listless appearance of the Dingzhou army, everyone thought that the court's operation on the grasslands had failed. The gazes they turned toward him were strange. Fan Xian and Li Hongqing had just entered the Qingzhou military yamen when Yi Ling'er, who had received the news, rushed back from the palace walls. Rushing into the back room, she pushed open the door and angrily said, "Do you think you're a god? How dare you bring so few people deep into the grasslands? Aren't you afraid the Hu people will eat you alive?" Yi Ling'er had her own reason to be angry. Although Fan Xian had not lost anything this time entering the grasslands, in reality, he had taken a great risk. Thinking of this, anger rose in Yi Ling'er's heart. If Fan Xian died on the grasslands, what would happen to Lin Wan'er? What would happen to the two children? As Lin Wan'er's bosom friend, she had sufficient reason to give the harshest criticism of Fan Xian's rash actions. Of course, there was another reason she was angry. Fan Xian had come to Qingzhou but had not come to see her. He had hidden such an important matter from her. Fan Xian paused with wisps of mist in his eyes as he watched the young lady of the Yi family break through the door and enter. His gaze unconsciously moved from the light armor on her body to the familiar and beautiful face. His heart was slightly moved. He knew that she was indeed concerned about his safety. However, looking at your appearance, you want to eat me alive even more than the Hu people, he said with a worried expression. Wang Fei, Hongqing and I aren't wearing clothes. You don't have to be so anxious, do you? After entering the Qingzhou military yamen, Fan Xian and Li Hongqing, who were covered in wind and sand and sore all over, had used their power and position to immediately prepare 2 large buckets of hot water. They were soaking comfortably when unexpectedly, a woman barged in. Furthermore, her identity was special. Yiling had grown up in the Dingzhou army. Her personality was bold and forceful. She was very different from other women. Hearing Fan Xian's words, she realized that Fan Xian and Li Hongqing were naked and curled up in the large wooden buckets. These 2 people still wore purposefully shy expressions on their faces. It was very annoying. On the contrary, she was not embarrassed or angry. She just spat at the side of her feet and elegantly turned to leave. On the grasslands, the left virtuous prince had been assassinated. Something had happened to the court. It was certain to sink into chaos. As the head of the Qing court's military stationed in Shiliang Road, Li Hongqing had to quickly report this matter to Jingdou. At the same time, he had to return to Dingzhou to hold down the camp and move military power in order to deal with the newest change in the situation on the grasslands. Thus the next day he left Qingzhou. Fan Xian stayed. It was not because of the good scenery in Qingzhou or because of Yiling. It was because he wanted to wait for a few people to return before he could truly relax. After a few days, the Central Plain merchant group Fan Xian had mixed into finally returned to Qingzhou covered in dust. Calculating the time, this merchant group had traveled very quickly. The path the merchant group took on their return journey was not the same as the path Fan Xian had taken. On the contrary, they had missed the soul-stirring chase. Seeing this group of merchants return safely, Fan Xian's mood relaxed slightly. He had been worried that because of the Overwatch Council's actions, these merchants from the Central Plain would become the target of the Hu people's revenge. Unexpectedly, the Hu people, under their rage, were still able to resist attacking the merchant group. It looked like Haitang's teachings these 2 years on the grasslands and the chief's decisions about the future had already affected many people. Soon after, a lonely shepherd who had lost his cows and sheep and was unable to continue living on the grasslands also entered the city of Qingzhou. However, no one knew that in this half a year, this lonely shepherd was playing the role of a mute servant who was used to hunching his body. The shadow had also returned safely. Fan Xian's heart relaxed a great deal. However, there was still no news from 13th Wang. He didn't know what his situation was, which worried him greatly. Although the Overwatch Council was used to using sinister methods to deal with all enemies, any method needed a powerful executor. Fan Xian himself was a powerful ace. He also had the shadow as his subordinates. If it weren't for these terrifying generals, even if he had lured Haitang and the chief away, he would not have been able to achieve the Overwatch Council's goal. The northern Qi people in the court would be dealt with by the shadow. The left virtuous prince who had to die needed another powerful warrior. Fan Xian had always been troubled by this. There were only a dozen top aces in the world. It was not until a long time later that he sent a probing invitation to 13th Wang through Baoyue brothel. After the Dong Mountain incident, 13th Wang had been serving the heavily injured and dying Sigu Jian in the sword hut in Dongyi. However, Sigu Jian miraculously dragged on and did not die, so 13th Wang never appeared in front of people again. Although Fan Xian and 13th Wang had an agreement 2 years ago, he didn't know if it was still in effect. Thus, this invitation was only a test. 13th Wang did not reply to a single word of this invitation. He directly left Dongyi and came to Jingdou to find Fan Xian. Fan Xian, the Shadow, and 13th Wang, the 3 aces went deep into the grasslands. They each had their own duties. In terms of the execution power represented by top aces, the present Overwatch Council was even more terrifying than when Qin Pingping was in power. It was because of 13th Wang's arrival that Fan Xian made up his mind to enter the grasslands. Because this person's identity was too special, Fan Xian didn't want the palace to be too suspicious of him. Thus he purposely hid his identity along the way. He only brought him into the merchant group and then separated. He still didn't understand why 13th Wang was still willing to continue the previous agreement after Sigu Jian had been beaten into a cripple by the emperor. He didn't have time to think about this. He only hoped that 13th Wang would be able to return safely after assassinating the Western Wuxia queen. After a few days, Fan Xian finally received the news he had been waiting for. More accurately speaking, everyone knew of 13th Wang's return. Unlike the Shadow's quiet return, the return of this 13th disciple of the Sword Hut startled the entire Qingzhou. That day the scorching sun hung high in the sky, shining down on Qingzhou city, causing the biting cold autumn wind to completely lose its temper. The green bricks at the city gates seemed to be about to emit smoke, and just like that, a bloody man walked through the city gates of Qingzhou city. The soldiers of Qingzhou looked warily at the bloody man. Holding long spears in their hands, they surrounded him. Enveloped by the coldness and murderous intent emanating from the bloody man's body, fear grew in their hearts. The man wore a Hu people's fur jacket. If the leather jacket with more than 30 cuts could still be considered a leather jacket, endless amounts of fresh blood seeped out of the holes in the leather jacket. It solidified, spread, and covered his entire body. No one knew how long the bloody man had walked on the grasslands. The bloody wounds had already begun to fester. Flies and mosquitoes danced around his body. It looked strangely wretched. The Qingzhou guards didn't know who this person was. They only knew that for him to be able to walk out of the grasslands with such heavy injuries, he was certainly no ordinary person. The man opened his eyes. His lips were covered in bloody blisters. To the soldiers surrounding him, he said, "Tell Fan Xian that I have done what I promised him." Receiving the news, Fan Xian rushed over and supported him. Looking at the wounds on his body, his heart was filled with a chill. He was responsible for luring out the chief and Haitang for the operation on the grasslands. In the end, Haitang would not kill him. Furthermore, the Shadow had acted silently and did not take much risk. The truly difficult part was 13th Wang assassinating the left virtuous prince. Fan Xian didn't know how 13th Wang had killed the powerful left virtuous prince in the Endless Hu camp. He only knew that what he had promised him had been completed perfectly. He carried the unconscious 13th Wang back to the military yamen. With a silent expression, he began to treat this fierce warrior. Yiling handed him needles and knives behind him. Her face was full of shock and curiosity. She wondered who this Overwatch Council official who had been cut more than 30 times was. How could he survive like this? Chapter 610. For some reason, from the first time 13th Wang appeared on that snowy night, he had trusted Fan Xian greatly. Otherwise he would not be sleeping like a baby in the room right now. Fan Xian stared in a daze at the unconscious young man on the bed and scratched his head. He couldn't find a suitable word to describe his current emotions. In the basin was a blood-soaked cloth. The bright red gave off a faint stench. In order to remove the leather jacket from 13th Wang's body, Fan Xian had expended a great deal of effort. The blood on the inside and outside of the jacket had long congealed and mixed with the wind and sand on the grasslands. Like glue, it stuck firmly to 13th Wang's body. He fed 13th Wang some medicine, pried open the already sealed wounds, squeezed out the pus inside, and restitched a number of wounds that had opened on the way here. After doing all this, Fan Xian was completely exhausted. Weakly, he sat on the side of the bed and stared at this man in a daze. Although he had taken the anesthetic and sunk into the deepest of unconsciousness, the pain in his body still made 13th Wang furrow his brows. This last disciple of the Dongi Sword Hut had a delicate and pretty face, particularly his brows, which were furrowed particularly nicely. He was like a philosopher's statue contemplating the problems of life. Fan Xian shook his head and threw the scissors and needles in his hands into the basin. He stretched. In the process of saving people, he had counted carefully. There were 38 wounds on 13th Wang's body. They were all knife wounds and they were all concentrated in the front half of his torso. There were many stories in the military camp about how the wounds were all in the front of the body. 13th Wang used his bravery and valiance to perfectly prove these stories. He had faced countless knives alone and charged out head-on. Fan Xian stared at him in a daze. Although he hadn't personally seen 13th Wang assassinate the left virtuous prince or the scene of killing when he charged out of the continuous Hu camp, each of these wretched knife wounds seemed to tell of what had happened a dozen days ago on the grasslands. When was the last time he had a comrade covered in wounds? It should have been in Shangjing in northern Qi. When he ripped open the young master's white robe, Fan Xian looked at 13th Wang on the bed and couldn't help but have the illusion that he and Yan Bingyun were the same person. However, 13th Wang's injuries were more serious than Yan Bingyun's. Furthermore, Fan Xian knew that the relationship between these two people and him was very different. Yan Bingyun was his subordinate and his arm, but he was also a loyal official of the Qin kingdom. 13th Wang had relied on him 2 years ago because of the interests of Dongi. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the unconscious 13th Wang. He did not understand. Was something like a promise really so important to some people in this world? Even more important than his own life? Fan Xian furrowed his brows. The unconscious 13th Wang also furrowed his brows. Both of them were good-looking. However, 13th Wang was less stern than Fan Xian and more amiable. In his coma there was a natural childishness. Both of them furrowed their brows at the same time. It was a wonderful sight. The sound of water being poured came from outside the room. Yiling filled a basin of hot water and walked back into the room. She wet a towel and then sat down on the side of the bed. Carefully she helped 13th Wang wipe away the blood on his body. However, there were too many wounds on his body. She couldn't find a place to start for a long time. 38 cuts. Yiling bit her lower lip. It was as if she was feeling pain for this unknown Overwatch Council official. I don't know what you had him do in the grasslands for him to come back alive with such serious injuries. Earlier when she was helping Fan Xian, Yiling was truly stunned. She was shocked by Fan Xian's superb medical skills. She was also shocked by the injuries of the person on the bed. Startled by Yiling's words, Fan Xian shook himself out of his thoughts. Pulling up the corners of his lips, he smiled helplessly. He is not an official of the Overwatch Council. Yiling glanced at him and didn't say anything. In reality, she had already guessed that the identity of the person lying on the bed was certainly not ordinary. Otherwise, Fan Xian would not have temporarily sealed off news of this person and had to trouble such a noble Wang Fei to personally help him. Fan Xian snatched the wet towel from her hand and wiped the sweat from his forehead. He is 13th Wang, a person from Dongyi. He is 13th Wang. Yiling's eyes immediately lit up. She sighed and said, no wonder he is so brave. Fan Xian asked, you've heard of him? Yiling nodded and said, don't have the extravagant hope of being able to hide news of him. In less than 2 days the emperor will know that he has interfered on the grasslands. You should think carefully about how to explain it. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. He wasn't afraid of explaining to the emperor. In the end, which side Dongyi would fall to, it was still Sigu Jianxin's words before his death. If he and 13th Wang improved their relationship, presumably the emperor would not be too angry. He was just curious as to why Yiling appeared to be so familiar with 13th Wang. Although not many people know that he was once your subordinate for more than half a year, many people in the military know that the Overwatch Council once had a powerful figure. Yiling seemed to have thought of something. Her expression dimmed. That year there was a rebellion at Dong Mountain. The emperor was surrounded and trapped at the top of the mountain. Shang Shanhu led the Northern Expedition Army soldiers to attack the mountain and forced the Imperial Army to retreat step by step. If it weren't for 13th Wang bravely holding the pass, the mountain would probably have been broken through long ago. I heard that he later blocked a blow from Granduncle. Yiling shrugged. That day this person left a deep impression on the Imperial Army. Everyone admired him greatly. After talking about him a lot these 2 years he became famous. Yiling's granduncle was the great Grandmaster Yi Luyun, who had disappeared without a trace after the Dong Mountain incident. Hearing these words, Fan Xian paused. He turned his head to glance at the unconscious 13th Wang and slowly said, given his brave and ferocious nature, if he was in the military, he would probably become a rarely seen fierce general. He didn't know that 2 years ago the famous general of Northern Qi, Shang Shanhu, had such an evaluation of 13th Wang at the mountain gate. After a few days 13th Wang woke up. No one knew what kind of power this young disciple of the Sword Hut had in his body for his injuries to heal quickly. On the day he woke up, Fan Xian suppressed the joy in his heart and asked straightforwardly, you are the future of Dongyi. What exactly are you planning by working so hard for me? 13th Wang had left Dongyi and returned to Fan Xian's side because of the promise in the snowy night, but it was not just because of this promise. He was silent for a moment. On his pale face, his brows, which were as thick as swords, appeared particularly frightening. After a long time he slowly said, teacher can't hold on much longer. Fan Xian was silent. Sigu Jian's death was something everyone had expected. In everyone's hearts, this great Grandmaster of Dongyi should have died 2 years ago. In the end, no one had thought that the most powerful idiot in the world would be able to drag on for 2 years until everyone was exhausted and embarrassed. It was to the point that everyone seemed to be hoping for his death. However, coming from 13th Wang's mouth, these words represented another meaning. Fan Xian knew that Sigu Jian did not have much time left. Dongyi had to immediately decide what path it was going to take in the future. 13th Wang entering Shiliang Road this time and performing such a great service for Fan Xian was also Sigu Jian's arrangement. Your teacher is a big idiot. I think it is very likely that you will inherit his legacy and become the second biggest idiot in the world. Fan Xian looked at 13th Wang's haggard face and coldly said, "You and Haitang are both orphans. Why throw away your head and spill your hot blood to protect such meaningless words?" 13th Wang smiled with some difficulty. He knew that while Fan Xian's words appeared mocking, they actually hid a glimmer of concern. He looked at Fan Xian and slowly said, "If it is not to protect something, then why are you here?" Fan Xian had nothing to say in response. 13th Wang finally said, "Teacher wants to see you one last time before he dies." Fan Xian's heart jumped slightly. He immediately calmed down. Furrowing his brows in thought for a moment, he then shook his head and said, "The Emperor will not let me accept the Dongyi matter." 13th Wang knew why he shook his head. Presently, Fan Xian was in charge of the Shiliang Road matter. If in the future even Dongyi was taken into the arms of the Qing kingdom through his hands, it would make things difficult for the Qing Emperor. In order to prevent an imbalance between ruler and officials, the Qing Emperor would probably not let Fan Xian handle the Dongyi matter. "Don't think of things too rosy." 13th Wang coughed. His newly healed wound almost burst open again. "The sword hut will open next spring. Teacher's intention is only to invite guests from various places to meet." Based on what 13th Wang said, Sigu Jian probably didn't have many days left to live. The opening of the sword hut in the spring of the 10th year of the Qing calendar was perhaps the last time this sword saint would show his brilliance in the world. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and said, "Guests from various places?" "Yes," 13th Wang replied. "Including guests from northern Qi." Fan Xian smiled. He knew what Sigu Jian was thinking. After the great grandmaster passed, Dongyi would not be able to protect itself. It had to find a good tree to rest on. Asking him and the nobles from northern Qi to attend the ceremony was to see which of the two powers in the world offered a higher price and who had the most sincerity. Dongyi had long shown Fan Xian its sincerity. This sincerity was the sincerity 13th Wang's words had delivered on that snowy night 3 years ago. It was sincerity written in 13th Wang's blood. "If your teacher asks too much, I won't be able to help much," Fan Xian said seriously to 13th Wang. Very seriously, Fan Xian said to 13th Wang, "You know I am speaking from the bottom of my heart. Never mind, rest well." After saying this, he realized that 13th Wang did not notice. Instead, his gaze had passed through the window and was cast toward a certain place in the courtyard. Fan Xian followed his gaze and saw Yi Ling-er in light yellow clothing. Yi Ling-er was sitting in the dusk. With a calm expression, she gazed at the lonely autumn trees outside the courtyard. She appeared particularly lonely. 13th Wang's gaze was very soft and lonely. Perhaps it was the wind, sand, and rain of blood on the grasslands that made this gentle but valiant man begin to appreciate the other side of life. Quietly he said, "This girl is very lonely." "She is Yi Ling-er, my disciple," Fan Xian said bitterly. "Her loneliness is a mistake made by me and all of her family." "Oh, right, during the days you were unconscious, it was she who looked after you." 13th Wang didn't turn his head. He only looked calmly at Yi Ling-er's silhouette in the distance. It was as if he was admiring a beautiful scene. Fan Xian suddenly remembered the first time he had met 13th Wang on that snowy night. He had used the name Tai Xiang and said he was going to Baoyue brothel to see all the beauties in the Qing kingdom. Involuntarily, a glimmer of a smile rose to the corners of his lips. He thought of some phrases and people. "You looked calmly out the window and I looked at you silently. The curtain held both of us, savoring the gentle loneliness." Fan Xian slowly rubbed the string of beads on his wrist. It was as if he had returned to the grasslands with Haitang gently leaning against his arm. It was impossible for Haitang to suddenly appear by his side. This reality made Fan Xian feel disappointed. Although he and Yan Bingyun had used 4 months and relied on the Shadow and 13th Wang's extraordinary strength to perfectly complete the Overwatch Council's plan, when he thought of Haitang still on the grasslands and the possibility that she would forever remain in the autumn grass and blue sea, Fan Xian felt anger for no reason. This anger was mostly directed at Ku He's arrangements before his death and his hatred for the little emperor of northern Qi. Of course, the present northern Qi emperor was no longer small. Although the connection between the palace treasury and the north had been greatly weakened because of the Qing emperor's powerful intimidation, the northern Qi emperor had quickly consolidated the court and fully demonstrated his ability to govern. Under the Qing kingdom's overbearing aura, he did not show any signs of defeat. On the contrary, he began to stretch out his hands and legs intending to counterattack. For example, in Shiliang Road. Fan Xian had spent a great deal of money to move Deng Ziyu back from northern Qi's Shangjing to target northern Qi's infiltration of Xiliang Road. Following the deaths of the northern Qi people in the court, the Overwatch Council's purge operation in Dingzhou and Qingzhou began with a bang. Because the Overwatch Council had prepared for a long time and the person in charge of this matter was Deng Ziyu, who knew the way the northern Qi brocade guard did things, it proceeded particularly smoothly. With the full cooperation of the General's Manor and the Governor's Manor of Xiliang Road, the Overwatch Council only used 10 days to capture over 40 northern Qi spies in Dingzhou and Qingzhou. The number of northern Qi spies who had died to the hands of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council had already surpassed 100. In order to destroy northern Qi's infiltration of Xiliang, Fan Xian had spent a great deal of money and exposed a few officials who had developed in the northern Qi court for many years to obtain the name list. He knew that although the Hu people on the grasslands appeared to be able to resist at the moment, if they were allowed to continue developing, they would become a great threat to the Qing kingdom. Thus he did not care about anything. He had to kill the signs of the Hu people's prosperity before the spring dew fell. He also knew that each time the Overwatch Council captured a northern Qi spy in Xiliang Road and killed a spy, the distance between him and Haitang would increase. Furthermore, there were still a few Channy Dao disciples lying in ambush in Xiliang Road. The death of the left virtuous prince of Xi who brought too many unstable factors to the grasslands. The hardliners, led by the foremost ace of the king's tent, Hu Gu, demanded that the chief of the court give an explanation for this matter. Without being conferred a title by the court, the left virtuous prince's tribe had elected the left virtuous prince's youngest son as the new left virtuous prince. At the same time, they raised the knife of revenge against the various powers on the grasslands. The biggest suspects for the left virtuous prince's death were, of course, the chief of the court and the right virtuous prince. Although the court had once said that the Qing kingdom's Overwatch Council had secretly done this, not many people believed it. Furthermore, Hu Gu was still picking fights internally. In order to stabilize the situation on the grasslands, Chief Su Bida was forced to acknowledge the new left virtuous prince's position. He sent envoys to pacify them and guarantee that they would give the left virtuous prince's subordinates a satisfactory explanation. What was a satisfactory explanation? It was the head of the murderer and the massacre of the murderer's tribe. The problem was that the murderer had long escaped. No one knew which tribe he was from. Thus the grasslands were in turmoil. At any moment, there was the possibility of a big battle breaking out. Additionally, the court had, in a short half a month, suddenly lost all of their spies in Xiliang Road and became blind. For a moment they were unable to respond. There were many troubles on the grasslands. However, these troubles needed Chief Su Bida and Haitang to resolve. As for Fan Xian who had created these troubles, he was not unhappy at all. He just watched everything that happened on the grasslands with cold eyes from Qingzhou. According to his agreement with Hu Gu would completely lean toward the chief of the court next spring. After all, given Hu Ji's current strength, even if he had the full support of the left virtuous prince's subordinates, he would not be able to overthrow the position of the chief of the court. Since it was so, it was better to change sides. Presumably, Chief Su Bida would happily welcome the arrival of the power that Hu Gu belonged to. With the chief's support, in addition to the Qing kingdom's secret support, presumably, it wouldn't be long before Hu Ji's tribe would develop and grow. At that time, Chief Su Bida would truly have a headache. The grasslands would welcome a truly difficult time. Concerning this matter, Fan Xian had only made the beginning. He dug 2 shovels and threw down a seed. He then waited for the seed to germinate, grow, and take over the place where the grass grew. It had to be admitted that his 2 shovels, particularly the 1/13th Wang had swung down, had truly taken the lives of the Hu people. Fan Xian stayed in Qingzhou not just to watch the show on the grasslands. He also wanted to watch the show playing out in Qingzhou. However, before he could finish watching the show in Qingzhou, he received a secret report from Jingdou. This secret report from Baoyue brothel regarding the great prince made him angry. Faintly he sighed, "The affairs of the world are difficult to predict. The affairs of the world are difficult to predict." The title of the chapter was a song by Do Wei. As for the monthly votes, I have already closed in to within 200 votes. It has been hard on everyone. It has been hard on me. Let's work hard together. Please continue to give me monthly votes. Chapter 6:11. Presently, Baoyue brothel had spread a large net throughout the world. Although all the powers knew that the largest brothel alliance in the world was the property of the Fan family, they had no way of controlling it. After all, this was proper business. Regardless of which country's laws, they could not control it. Baoyue Brothel's conditions were good. They were polite and considerate to the girls in the building. The guests were truly happy and labor and management were harmonious. Furthermore, they had Fan Xian's power as a backer and Xia Mingji and Zhaoshang Money House as financial support. In a short 4 years they had spread their tentacles to every place. Although Baoyue Brothel's intelligence gathering was not as professional or powerful as the Overwatch Council's, at least it provided Fan Xian with another source of information. In the end, the Overwatch Council was the official spy organization of the Qin Kingdom. There was always a faint fear in Fan Xian's heart. If one day the Emperor had him hand over the Overwatch Council, then his eyesight and hearing would both decline greatly. For example, this secret report regarding the Great Prince proved the benefits of Fan Xian's strong support for Baoyue Brothel. As for the information in the secret report, the Overwatch Council's report and even the Qinian unit's secret report did not mention a single word. If Baoyue Brothel had not leaked it out, Fan Xian would not have known that another good show was about to play out in Jingdo. Of course, Fan Xian knew that this matter could not be blamed on the Overwatch Council and the Qinian unit. After all, it involved the face of the royal family and the emperor's family matters. Even if the official spy organization had found some information, before it could be confirmed and with the internal court and imperial censorate watching, they could not report it to him without evidence. Baoyue Brothel did not care about this. In the organization structure under Fan Xian's control, Baoyue Brothel was more like the imperial censorate. It had the freedom to hear rumors and discuss official matters. The secret report mentioned the Great Prince taking on a secondary fey. It was just a rumor that occasionally spread through Jingdo. Wind from an empty cave was not without reason. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and thought about what had happened in Jingdo. If it was just the eldest prince taking on a secondary wife, it would have been a small matter. There was no need for him to be so nervous. But the key point was that the Baoyue House's report made it very clear that the selection of a secondary wife was completely decided by the palace. The eldest prince did not know about this beforehand, and it was rumored that the eldest prince was very conflicted about this matter. He had already entered the palace and argued with the king twice. Fan Xian's head hurt. He knew what kind of person his elder brother was. Although the great prince understood the big picture when it came to family matters involving the root of the family, he was very stubborn. Additionally, his relationship with the great Wang Fei was harmonious. How could he agree to another marriage in the palace? For the palace to want him to take another secondary fei, there was clearly a deeper level of consideration. Regarding this, Fan Xian knew very well. Ever since the Jingdo rebellion had truly been quelled and the emperor had once again found his love for his eldest son, the first thing he did was not move the great prince to the border army as a commander with real power. Instead, he secretly prepared for the great prince to take on a secondary fei. Thus, the matter of taking on a secondary fei had actually been carried out in secret for a long time. However, it had been forcefully resisted by the great prince and had not truly surfaced. The great Wang Fei was the great princess of northern Qi. The honeymoon period between the Qin kingdom and northern Qi had already ended. For the sake of future battles, the emperor would not allow his eldest son to be controlled by a northern Qi woman. In the final northern expedition, the great prince was clearly the best choice for the vanguard commander. The emperor's intentions were clear. He would first have him take on a secondary fei. Then he would find an opportunity and an excuse to depose the great Wang Fei. The meaning was clear. It was a pity that the Qing emperor's sons were disobedient. The great prince had never been such an obedient person, which was why he had been able to resist for 2 years. However, from the news from the Baoyue house, it seemed that the palace was preparing to bring this matter to light and directly make the decision. Fan Xian hugged his knees with a headache. He was very angry. He had a strong opinion of the great prince. He thought to himself, since the emperor is forcing him so fiercely, what are you afraid of if you agree for now? Delay it as long as you can. Do you really have to wait for the emperor to give an edict and then have you go to the palace and play a game of refusing to submit? How could a member of the royal family have the right to be a saint of love? However, the great prince and the great Wang Fei, this married couple, had a sense of a long-lasting relationship. It made Fan Xian feel great admiration and sigh at his own inferiority. Other than admiration, what made Fan Xian's head hurt was that the intelligence report from Baoyue House was vague but secretly revealed a piece of information. After the emperor and Lady Ning discussed it, they temporarily suppressed their anger and prepared to have Fan Xian return to the capital to persuade the great prince to take on a secondary fei. It had to be said that after the Jingdo rebellion and the deaths of the crown prince and second prince, the Qing emperor's attitude toward his remaining 3 sons was much warmer than before. If it had been in the past, the great prince would probably have long been imprisoned in his manor if he dared to forcefully resist an edict. It was not like now where he could resist his temper and let Fan Xian go persuade him. The emperor's secret edict would probably take some time before it reached Fan Xian's ears. Baoyue House received the news much faster. Fan Xian held his head and thought, what exactly is going on? When the great princess of northern Qi had traveled thousands of li south to marry the great prince, he had been the one to officiate the wedding. Was he going to be the one to break off the marriage after 4 years? Just as he had sighed earlier, the affairs of the world were truly hard to predict. It was morning. The sunlight from the east shone through the lonely autumn trees in the Qingzhou military yamen and cut into a few large patches of light, illuminating the paper windows in the room. A serving girl carried a plate and passed by the window, casting a shadow on the window. The shadow stood quietly by Fan Xian's side and looked at his worried face without saying a word. The best assassin in the world was used to standing quietly behind Chen Pingping or Fan Xian, blending into the shadows of the building or scenery. He was used to seeing the constant worry of the last masters of the Overwatch Council, but he was still not used to talking to them and giving them advice. His mission was to kill people and did not include these pitiful things that used his brain. After returning from the grasslands, the shadow took off his herdsman's clothes and returned to Fan Xian's side. Just like in the past few years, he was very quiet. However, Fan Xian occasionally noticed that the best assassin in the world would occasionally glance at 13th Wang, who was resting in the courtyard. His gaze was complicated and strange. I cannot return to the capital right now. Fan Xian knew that the shadow was not Yan Bingyun, Deng Ziyu, or the chatterbox Wang Qinian. Waiting for him to speak was an impossible matter. He rubbed the space between his brows and said, First, the Shiliang Road matter has not ended. Second, since there is no news from the capital, it is not appropriate for me to rush back like this. This is only a small matter. The shadow knew that Commissioner Fan wanted to talk to him. He paused for a moment and then said, Don't worry too much. Fan Xian shook his head and sighed. It is not a small matter. You don't know how stubborn the men of the Li family are. Take Qingqian and the second prince for example. They would rather die stubbornly than lower their heads to the emperor. Although the great prince's personality is much more open-minded, in his bones, he has the taste of Dongyi people's desire for freedom. With the emperor pressuring him like this, who knows what kind of frightening response he will make. Not waiting for the shadow to open his mouth to reply, Fan Xian's face was full of melancholy. He continued, The emperor, and perhaps everyone in court, seems to firmly believe one thing. Those who are not of our race must have different intentions. Otherwise, why would no one believe that the great prince will inherit the throne just because he is half Dongyi? He is half Dongyi, and his Wang Fei is a northern Qi person. In the current situation, the emperor wanting him to depose of his concubine actually has the intention of protecting him and placing him in an important position. In the Jingdo rebellion, there were 3 people who had performed meritorious deeds. They were Fan Xian Yizhong and the great prince. At the time, the great prince held the imperial army in his hands and controlled the vital points. However, he resolutely carried out the emperor's so-called posthumous edict and successfully controlled the situation of the rebellion to a level that the Qing kingdom could accept. Because of this matter, the emperor's attitude toward him had changed greatly. It was no longer as cold as it had been in the past. Accurately speaking, the emperor feels some guilt toward the great prince, Fan Xian said quietly as he rubbed the spot between his brows. As Fan Xian rubbed his aching brows, he quietly said, So he wants to make it up to the great prince. Given the great prince's lifelong ambition, the best way to make it up to him is to be the vanguard and fight for the Qing kingdom from the south to the north, unify the world and shine on the battlefield. The emperor has truly decided to use him as commander, which is why he has to depose the great Wang Fei. Thinking of this, he also felt some resentment toward the emperor. The great Wang Fei was the great princess of northern Qi. It did indeed affect the great prince's decision to be the commander of the northern expedition. But, why did he have to use such unconventional methods as taking a secondary Fei to resolve it? This was not the demeanor a ruler of a country should have. It was more like an old man who was angry with his son. Suddenly his heart jumped. Did the emperor still not learn from his past experiences and still maintain a powerful suspicion? Is he using all kinds of methods to eliminate these suspicions in the bud? Fan Xian's heart gradually grew cold. He realized that he had made a mistake these years. He had still underestimated the emperor's powerful desire for power and the emperor's natural paranoia and coldness. It was difficult to be a son. It was even more difficult to be the son of the emperor. It was even more difficult to be the son of the Qing emperor. Fan Xian let out a shaky breath. He knew that after he returned to the capital, he would probably be stuck between the emperor and the great prince. It was better not to think about this problem for now. But he was a little curious. He didn't know whose daughter the emperor had appointed to the great prince's side concubine was, and which noble or minister was so unafraid of death that they dared to send their daughter into the mouths of the tigress great Wang Fei, the great prince, the male tigress and the old tigress concubine Ning. After the Jingdo rebellion, the emperor remembered Lady Ning's merits and took into account the great prince's face. After a delay of more than 20 years, he finally made her an imperial consort. However, after this Dongi female slave became an imperial consort, she still did not change her past shrewish personality. She was still full of tiger nature. The great prince's family was a tiger forest. In any case it could not be Ruorwo. Fan Xian was confident of this. Presently the emperor trusted and favored him greatly. He also knew that for the sake of Ruorwo's marriage, he had not hesitated to beat Hongqing into a lewd person. Naturally he would not use this to seduce him and lose the big for the small. Fan Xian stood and pushed open the door. He welcomed the courtyard filled with the colors of autumn and no longer thought about the troubles in Jingdo. It was already late autumn. As far as the eye could see, the military yamen was filled with a clean and distant color. The sky was very high and the clouds were very light. It made one feel a sense of open-mindedness at a glance. The city of Qingzhou was close to Shihu and had the air of the grasslands. Perhaps only in this kind of place could people cultivate a cheerful and beautiful mood, such as the unusual great prince of the royal family, or the unusual Yi Ling-er of the nobility. Fan Xian smiled slightly as he gazed at the girls in the courtyard. He thought to himself that the great Wang Fei's present situation was very difficult, but the second Wang Fei seemed to have gradually shaken off the shadow of the second prince's death. There were always some good things that happened in the world. 13th Wang's body recovered quickly. He was now able to wander around the Qingzhou military yamen in a wheelchair. Because of Yi Ling-er's words, Fan Xian couldn't be bothered to do any more useless concealment. He called for a few girls to be responsible for pushing the cart and sent a few subordinates of the 6th Bureau to follow him and protect his safety. During these dozen days, Fan Xian had been busy communicating with Dingzhou and leading the counterattack in Shiliang Road. He also had to carry out private transactions with the grasslands. He was very busy and didn't pay much attention to 13th Wang's movements. However, he was not blind. He could see that this lonely and desolate Qingzhou military yamen had gradually changed because of 13th Wang's awakening. Occasionally, a hint of spring seeped through the autumn garden. When 13th Wang sat in his wheelchair and occasionally rested in the garden, not far from him, a girl would be sitting and doing other things such as embroidery or playing dumb and looking at the scenery. At that time, 13th Wang would become a dumb goose and stare in a daze at the dumb goose looking at the scenery. Other than greeting each other when they bumped into each other, this young man and woman did not say any idle words. They just foolishly played out their roles. They wanted to sing to the sky but were also afraid that their red palms would lightly tug and disturb the unfocused clear waves. Fan Xian was the little ancestor of the Overwatch Council, and Yi Ling-er was the little ancestor of Qingzhou. After she gave the order, they no longer went out of the city every day to intercept the Hu people galloping out of the grasslands to gather grain like they had in the past year. Instead, they stayed obediently in the military yamen. The old subordinates in the military yamen were all chased out, leaving only the servants and serving girls. Thus, there was now an additional scenery in the Qingzhou military yamen's little garden. It was the appearance of the two dumb geese that Fan Xian was secretly laughing at in his heart. If one were to use a more beautiful phrase, it would be the scenery, the people in the scenery, and the people looking at the scenery. For two people who admired each other, each was the other's scenery, right? As her teacher, Fan Xian knew what kind of woman Yi Ling-er was. Sometimes, when he asked himself honestly if he was a woman, he would probably also be shaken to the core by the 38 knife marks on 13th Wang's front. Furthermore, 13th Wang was a silent, gentle, and handsome person. How could such a person not move Yi Ling-er, who had been born in the military? Although Yi Ling-er's identity was somewhat troublesome, Fan Xian was not worried about it. 2 years ago, the emperor had secretly given a gracious edict allowing Yi Ling-er to remarry and choose her own husband. This was a great grace. As long as she liked someone, the Qing court would probably snatch him for her even if it meant fighting for him. The problem now was 13th Wang's identity. Although he secretly worked for the Overwatch Council and the emperor also secretly knew of this matter, he was, after all, Sigu Jian's last disciple and the 13th disciple of Dongi's sword hut. Yi Ling-er had once been the second Wang Fei, Yet she was going to marry an ace from Dongyi. No one knew if she would be able to get past the palace. Of course, if Dongyi could completely lean toward the Qing kingdom under his leadership, then these obstacles would not exist. Fan Xian decided to put some effort into this matter. It could be considered making it up to this pitiful girl on behalf of the emperor and Yi Zhong. There was only one problem. Fan Xian looked at the two people in the garden with amusement. Rubbing his nose, he thought that these two people were still in a strange state. Someone had to expose them. Most importantly, it was not strange that Yi Ling'er liked 13th Wang. What exactly was 13th Wang thinking? No matter how noble Yi Ling'er's identity was, she was, after all, a true widow. He knew why 13th Wang was attracted to Yi Ling'er's profile. Was very lonely. Fan Xian knew that the real Yi Ling'er was not like this. Particularly, embroidery. Fan Xian shivered. Yi Ling'er had actually embroidered in front of 13th Wang and pretended to be delicate and timid. If this matter got back to Jingdo and reached Wan'er's ears, his wife would probably faint from laughter. He decided to tell 13th Wang the real Yi Ling'er so that his young friend, whom he admired greatly, would not find out after marriage that his life was a major misunderstanding. Just as Fan Xian was walking down the stone steps and preparing to disturb this supercilious young man and woman, the shadow behind the door quietly said something. He immediately stopped his steps. These days, the shadow had carefully hidden his tracks to prevent 13th Wang from discovering anything. Fan Xian knew the complicated relationship between the shadow and the sword hut. He also knew the shadow's true identity could not be known by anyone. Sigu Jian and the shadow had an irreconcilable hatred. Looking at Sigu Jian's favorite disciple in the autumn garden, the shadow's mood was not as happy as the man and woman in the garden. A moment later Fan Xian said, "We'll go next spring. He won't die so early." Chapter 6:12. As for Sigu Jian's life and death, the shadow was more concerned than anyone else. He did not want Sigu Jian to die to someone else's hands, even if it was the merciless hands of heaven. Many years ago, Dongyi had suddenly fallen into chaos. Sigu Jian had gone mad with his sword and slaughtered all the elders and relatives of his clan. Only the 16-year-old shadow had escaped. From the age of 16, the shadow's life had continued with the thought of revenge against his elder brother. He gradually sank in powerful fear and anger and became the shadow behind the two leaders of the Overwatch Council. The reason Sigu Jian was called an idiot was probably because his methods when he slaughtered his own clan were too bloody and crazy. As for how the shadow escaped Dongyi, met Qin Pingping and was accepted into the Overwatch Council by Qin Pingping, became loyal and fought to the death, that was perhaps another long story. Fan Xian was not very clear on this point and didn't want to ask too closely. Everyone beside him had their own stories and their own secrets, such as Jinggu, the Yan family, and the shadow. However, he knew the identity the shadow hid in the deepest part and the blood feud between him and Sigu Jian. Just like how he treated the other people beside him, Fan Xian and them helped each other and supported each other as they walked through these difficult times. Fan Xian didn't turn his head. In a quiet voice he said, "I know you've always wanted to ask him something. Don't worry, you will definitely be able to ask." The shadow was silent for a moment and then disappeared behind Fan Xian. He did not let 13th Wang and Yi Ling'er in the garden detect a trace. Fan Xian was silent for a moment and then walked toward the garden. In a moment, he had arrived between the silent man and woman. 13th Wang raised his head and glanced at him, feeling slightly surprised. The Qing court was currently in Shiliang Road fighting the Hu people of the grasslands and northern Qi's reinforcements. For a dozen consecutive days, Fan Xian had been extremely busy because of this matter. Why did he have the leisure to come out to the garden now? Yi Ling'er had her head bowed as she worked on her taut embroidery frame. She had long since sensed Fan Xian's arrival, and immediately jumped out of the quiet, peaceful and happy atmosphere she had been in. Her heart was filled with hidden bitterness, and the already slow speed of her needles became even slower. It didn't seem like she was embroidering, but more like she was using the tip of a thin needle to tickle the taut fabric. Fan Xian stood between the two of them. Since they did not speak, he could not find any reason to speak. With his hands behind his back, he put on an expression as if he knew everything. Gazing at the lonely autumn trees outside the garden, he pretended to be elegant. Seeing him act so pretentiously, 13th Wang didn't know if Fan Xian had seen through the thoughts he had never expressed. His gaze became slightly chaotic. Yi Ling'er glanced at him, lowered her head, and gently bit her lower lip. The time had come. Fan Xian coughed and said, "Wang Fei, although the scenery in Qingzhou is not bad, you embroider in the garden every day. With the garden walls blocking your vision, it is impossible to see clearly, right? Hearing the words Wang Fei, Yi Linger thought Fan Xian was reminding her of something. Her face immediately paled and she didn't reply. 13th Wang was silent. Like Yi Linger, he had also misunderstood Fan Xian's meaning. He thought to himself that although he had not spoken much with the young lady of the Yi family, he knew she was a woman with a refreshing personality. There was indeed a chord in his heart that had been tugged at by the wind in Qingzhou. However, she was, after all, the Qing Wangfei. The difference in status was too great. Fan Xian sighed and turned his head to 13th Wang. 13th, although you are heavily injured and need someone to take care of you, after all, men and women have to be careful, particularly since the young lady of the Yi family is the Qing kingdom's Wangfei. There is no one else in the garden watching. You two just sit facing each other like this. You have to think about how I will explain this to the palace when I return to the capital. These words made things clear. 13th Wang had been sighing earlier, but under the gentleness of his personality, there was an incomparable stubbornness. Raising his brows, he looked at Fan Xian and said, I'll leave the manor immediately. Yi Linger raised her head in shock and glared fiercely at Fan Xian. Fan Xian's heart jumped slightly. Shortly after, he smiled warmly and thought to himself that this was a 13th Wang worthy of his trust. Ignoring Yi Linger's angry glare beside him, he flipped his palm and drew 3 circles in the air. He then grabbed at the embroidery cloth in front of Yi Linger. It was gentle and windless, but it was also very fast. It was the little trick he had relied on to become famous. Yi Linger's fingertips unconsciously tightened. The embroidery needle carried the sound of the wind as it pierced toward Fan Xian's wrist at a tricky angle. This was also a little trick. However, these tricks had been taught to her by Fan Xian, so how could she stop Fan Xian from stealing the cloth? With a flash of a figure, Fan Xian had already taken the embroidery cloth from her hands and floated to 13th Wang's side. With a smile he said, 13th, I was just afraid you'd be tricked. Our Wangfei is not a young lady of a large family who knows how to embroider. 13th Wang was slightly startled. He didn't understand why the commissioner would suddenly say this. Immediately after, he saw Fan Xian place the embroidery cloth in front of his eyes. Embroidered on the cloth was half a water duck? Yi Linger had been in the garden, where 13th Wang could see, embroidered for a whole 7 days. In the end, she had only embroidered half a water duck? 13th Wang immediately understood what Fan Xian meant by a misunderstanding and couldn't resist smiling slightly. It was Fan Xian who laughed loudly and said, the pleasure between a man and a woman is a matter of course. No one can stop you. However, you have to think carefully. Yi Linger abruptly rose. She was so angry that her entire body trembled. She looked angrily at Fan Xian, but she was too embarrassed to say anything. Mist gradually rose in her eyes. She appeared very pitiful. 13th Wang looked at this woman's appearance and felt an inexplicable pain in his heart. He withdrew his smile and his face was full of concern. Fan Xian slowly stopped laughing. Suddenly he lowered his voice and said by 13th Wang's ear, you have to talk about love. Even if these 2 dumb geese were to sit together for a lifetime, what use would it be? 13th Wang knew that this person had come specially to help him break through the layer of paper on the window. Other than feeling slightly embarrassed, he couldn't help feeling grateful. However, he was unable to speak as shamelessly as Fan Xian. Yi Linger didn't know what Fan Xian had said. Looking at the 2 of them whispering to each other, she felt very uneasy. Fan Xian had finished what he needed to do and leisurely walked toward the front yard of the military yamen. His posture was relaxed as if he had done something very good and was very pleased with himself. Yi Linger looked at his retreating figure. For some reason, a great dissatisfaction rose in her heart. She huffed lightly and mockingly said, Teacher, I don't know how to embroider, but this water duck, I'm afraid, it's better than the one in your house. Hearing these words, Fan Xian immediately thought of the needle marks on Wanner's fingers, as well as the water duck painting. A chill ran through his body, and his face was filled with embarrassment. How could he reply? He quickly fled into the wilderness. Looking at this scene, Yi Linger giggled. Her laughter echoed like silver bells in the autumn garden in Qingzhou. However, the person beside her did not laugh. He only looked at her quietly and appreciatively. It was boring to laugh alone. Yi Linger awkwardly stopped laughing. During the dozen days 13th Wang had been recovering, she had indeed restrained her free and arrogant nature. She appeared particularly peaceful. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian had still managed to break through. She didn't know if this scene fell into the man's eyes or if he would feel that she was too bitter. Countless thoughts immediately flashed through her mind. The emotions in her eyes were incomparably complicated. 13th Wang was actually a bit nervous, but he hid it well on his face. Looking at Yi Linger, he said, "I am Wang Shi, formerly known as Tai Xiang. I am the 13th disciple of Dongyi Sword Hut. Thank you for your care these days. I cannot thank you enough." Yi Linger had not thought that he would suddenly speak so seriously. Her heart was a little flustered. She calmed herself and returned the greeting. Lightly she said, "Sir Wang is too polite." In Yi Linger's opinion, it was much more relaxed and natural to use an official's title to refer to him. She did not understand. They had already known each other for a dozen days and had only exchanged a dozen sentences. Why did he have to express his thanks so seriously now? Was he truly prepared to leave the manor, or was all of this just a dream? Yi Linger sighed faintly in her heart. If it had been another woman, perhaps she would have chosen to leave because of this sense of serenity. However, Yi Linger was after all Yi Linger. She did not know how to embroider. She only knew how to wield knives and spears. Although she was a widow, she was still like she was when she was a teenager, wild and full of vigor. She stared closely into 13th Wang's eyes and said, "If you have something to say, just say it. There is no need to introduce yourself. Looking at the way you do things, you are also a straightforward person. Don't be as long-winded and hypocritical as Fan Xian." 13th Wang paused slightly. A moment later he said seriously, "Sir Fan Jr. said that everything can be discussed." Yi Linger understood some of the meaning. Suddenly she felt a gust of autumn wind blow past. When it brushed against her face, there was not a trace of harshness. There was only 100 degrees of gentleness. The matter between 13th Wang and Yi Linger was not as Fan Xian had imagined. After his provocation, they met in the golden wind and jade dew. It was better than countless things in the mortal world. When dry wood and fierce fire met, it was like the yellow river overflowing and could not be stopped. On the contrary to his expectations, this young man and woman still maintained their politeness and sat across the stone path. They would only occasionally say a few words. Speaking of which, it was strange. 13th Wang and Yi Linger's personalities were both first-rate, particularly Yi Linger, who had grown up on the edge of the grasslands. Compared to the young ladies in Jingdo, she was much more cheerful. However, once love was involved because of the tragedy in Jingdo 2 years ago as well as 13th Wang's identity, both of them were somewhat silent. Seeing all of this, Fan Xian was not in a rush. In any case, there were always thousands of things in the world. It was impossible to ask all men and women in love to be like him, impatient to climb walls and jump through windows. Furthermore, he didn't have time to pay attention to these beautiful things. He still needed to take the lead in dealing with the not-so-beautiful things in Shiliang Road. Time quickly came to the end of autumn and the beginning of winter. The 8 bureaus of the Overwatch Council gathered in Dingzhou. The 8 tribes on the grasslands gathered in the court to discuss matters. With unusual ruthlessness, the Qin kingdom cut off the hand that the grasslands had extended, as well as the hand that northern Qi had extended toward the grasslands. They watched with cold eyes as the situation on the grasslands became more and more unbearable by the day. The hand that Master Ku He had set up on the grasslands before he died and the hand that the northern Qi emperor had crossed the North Sea, the desert and the Qin kingdom's border in over a year gently clasped at the border between Shiliang Road and the grasslands. After holding it for almost a year, it had put the Qin court to the test. The borders were unusually tight. The national treasury, military power and spirit were all forced to stay in the west, slowing the pressure on their true enemy, northern Qi. Under the emperor's leadership, the Overwatch Council used 4 months to prepare. Fan Xian personally led the team. Finally, in the late autumn and cold winter of the 9th year of the Qin calendar, they cut off these 2 hands that held each other. Perhaps the situation on the grasslands under the control of Chief Su Bida and Hai Tang would not deteriorate to an unmanageable level. However, it would not be so easy for the northern Qi emperor to cause trouble in Shiliang Road. Furthermore, Fan Xian had also set up his own power on the grasslands. When the flowers bloomed next spring, he would begin to reap the fruits. After confirming the implementation of the various arrangements and verifying the results of the battle, Fan Xian finally freed himself from the extremely busy council affairs and began to prepare to return to the capital. 13th Wang would not follow him back to the capital. Firstly, his injuries had not healed. Secondly, Fan Xian did not want him to have too much contact with the shadow along the way. Thirdly, Yi Linger's return to the capital for the new year was still half a month later. It was always good for the two of them to spend more time together. Once Fan Xian had decided on something, he rarely changed it. Since he had decided to help Yi Linger and 13th Wang be together, he had his own confidence. After returning to the capital and taking care of the great prince's family matters, he would probably have to go to the Bureau of Military Affairs to propose marriage to General Yi. Of course, this matter first required the emperor's approval. On the 15th day of the winter of the 9th year of the Qing calendar, the Overwatch Council finished their operation in Shiliang Road. The commissioner Fan Xian passed through Dingzhou and stepped on the road back to the capital. Outside Dingzhou, there were countless officials and generals who had come to see him off. They lined up densely in 2 rows. The governor of Shiliang Road and General Li Hongqing stood side by side with Fan Xian. After saying a few official words, they ended the conversation. At the end, Li Hongqing gazed deeply at Fan Xian. Fan Xian knew what he meant and did not reply. He only quietly said, "I'll wait for you in Jingdou." The group of carriages set off and drove onto the official road in front of Dingzhou. Fan Xian unconsciously turned his head back to look. He did not stop his gaze on the Dingzhou military and political officials. Instead, he raised his head and looked at the row of wooden frames on the Dingzhou city gates. An entire row of wooden frames was nailed to the top of the Dingzhou city gates. On each frame hung a corpse. In this operation they had executed over 40 spies. After these spies died, they still could not find a place to rest. They were hung high above the city gates and allowed the autumn wind to blow and the autumn sun to shine. Some of the corpses that had been hung the earliest had almost completely rotted. Even the evil birds in the fields were unwilling to peck at them, revealing the white bones that could faintly be seen below. The clothes on the corpses were in tatters and carried the black bloodstains of torture. A long row of corpses swayed slowly in the wind above the city gate. It gave off a terrifying and bloody stench, and it welcomed all the people who came from the Chinese plains. This terrifying scene served as a warning to all the people in the world. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and pulled his head back from the window. Hanging corpses had its own effect in psychological warfare. At least, the spies the Northern Qi Emperor would send in the future would at least have an innate sense of fear. However, in the battles of the Central Plain, due to the balance of morality and benevolence that had existed for thousands of years, the killing of prisoners of war was rare. As for humiliating corpses, it had never been seen before. Dingzhou was not the Central Plain. This was an important place in the battle between the Central Plain and Shihu. The two sides had fought for thousands of years and had done even crueler things. Fan Xian did not have much sympathy for the spies. What he had seen along the way from Dingzhou to Qingzhou had made him understand that once the war began, particularly the lingering hatred between nations, it could not be resolved by benevolence and morality. Just the dozens of corpses hanging above the city gates had caused the Qing kingdom to pay with the deaths of thousands of commoners. What made Fan Xian even colder was that these people were not Hu people. They were Northern Qi people of the same origin and ancestry as the people of the Qing kingdom. As for the hatred between the grasslands and the Central Plain, his generation did not have the ability to resolve it peacefully, so he would leave it to the more intelligent descendants. Fan Xian closed his eyes and rested. He thought to himself that he had severed the hand that held Northern Qi and the grasslands. At the very least he had severely wounded them. He had probably also cut a wretched wound between him and Haitang. He didn't know if this wound would heal in the future. He didn't know what Haitang would do on the grasslands. This grassland, this grand city, that border, would he ever come again in this life? As he thought these gloomy thoughts, the imperial envoy's carriage had already arrived at the closest relay station outside Dingzhou. It was the place where Fan Xian had peeped at the erotic palace. Entering the relay station, Fan Xian teased the deputy he was familiar with. However, the deputy who had been released from prison with great difficulty, did not dare to respond loudly. He obediently went to boil water. Fan Xian looked at Deng Ziyu beside him and said, "Ziyu, I'll need you to endure in Shiliang Road for another 2 years." All 8 bureaus of the Overwatch Council had sent important officials to Dingzhou to supervise the battle. Deng Ziyu had been summoned back from the distant Northern Qi by Fan Xian. Now that Fan Xian had left, the matters of Shiliang Road were all handed over to Deng Ziyu. The officials saw the imperial envoy out of the city and returned, but the officials of the Overwatch Council saw them all the way to the relay station. Deng Ziyu nodded and said, "I'll listen to your arrangements." Fan Xian thought for a moment and gave him some instructions. He then began to read the court bulletins from Jingdou. A moment later his eyes narrowed slightly. As the second person in charge of the Qinian unit, Deng Ziyu had served Sir Fan Jr. for a long time. Seeing him narrow his eyes, he knew something troublesome had happened. Fan Xian smiled and said, "It was mentioned in the council bulletins. The court bulletins have finally confirmed that the commander of the imperial army in the palace has changed." Deng Ziyu's heart jumped. He thought to himself, the great prince has always been safe in leading the imperial army. Why would there suddenly be a change? Chapter 613. The court bulletin and council report stated clearly that the position of commander of the Jingdo Imperial Army was no longer held by the great prince. It had been given to Gong Dian. After Gong Dian had quelled the rebellion in Jingdo, he had once again taken up his old position as commander of the palace guards. It was not strange that he was now also the commander of the imperial army. Everyone knew of the Yi family's loyalty to the emperor. The royal palace was no longer the responsibility of the great prince's safety, so it could only be given to Gong Dian. The problem now was, after the great prince was no longer the commander of the imperial army, what position would the emperor place him in? The court bulletin did not say, and there were no clear rumors in Jingdo. Fan Xian looked at the paper in his hand and couldn't help but shake his head. A few important appointments had been made in Jingdo. These appointments were all concentrated in the military. It was clear that the emperor had some thoughts. Furthermore, he was beginning to open up a position for the great prince. What caught Fan Xian's attention the most was that the commander of the Jingdo garrison, Xiao Jinhua, had been removed from his position and had been transferred to the Nanzhao border army to be the deputy governor. The governor of the northern expedition camp, Shi Fei, had been summoned back by the emperor to take over the important position of commander of the Jingdo garrison. Above Shi Fei, the governor of the Yanjing camp, Wang Jikuan, remained where he was. These three transfers of military generals were not normal. Fan Xian knew very well the roles these generals played. He also understood the emperor's different attitudes toward each of them. For example, the commander of the Jingdo garrison, Xiao Jinhua. During the Jingdo rebellion, he was only the commander of the Donghua Gate of the 13 city guards. Because he had stood his ground firmly and forcefully blocked the remaining soldiers of the Qin family, which belonged to the crown prince, within Jingdo, he had performed a great service. That was why the emperor had promoted him 3 levels and made him the commander of the Jingdo garrison. This could be considered the emperor's expression toward a loyal official. Fan Xian had long guessed that the emperor would not let this minor character, Xiao Jinhua, be the commander of the Jingdo garrison for too long. For one, his foundation was too shallow. It would be difficult for him to convince the masses and take on such an important responsibility as the Jingdo garrison. For another, Xiao Jinhua had come from the 13 city gate guards. The emperor had been bitterly disappointed by their performance during the Jingdo rebellion. The emperor trusted Zhang Diqing the most, but Zhang Diqing had sided with the eldest princess. Although the emperor had Zhang Diqing killed by 1,000 cuts and destroyed 3 of his clans, he had not vented the anger in his heart. Xiao Jinhua had been caught in the crossfire, but this person presumably knew the use of his symbol. He should be able to accept going to Nanzhao to be the deputy governor. The situation in the Northern Expedition Army was rather complicated. Yan Xiaoyi had been killed by Fan Xian on the summit of the mountain. The Qin Kingdom's Northern Expedition camp next at Sangzhou had been implicated in the rebellion and had faced countless purges in the past 2 years. The court had never allowed General Shi Fei to officially take over the position of governor of the Northern Expedition Army. Instead, he only had the right to know that he was under the jurisdiction of the Yanjing camp's Wang Jikuan. General Shi Fei had been Wang Jikuan's deputy for the past decade, so there should be no problem with this arrangement. Since the emperor had Shi Fei return to the capital to take over as commander of the Jingdo garrison, the position of governor of the Northern Expedition camp was empty. Who was it for? Fan Xian shook his head and thought that probably everyone could see clearly that the position of governor of the Northern Expedition Army, which was at the heart of the world struggle, was left for the great prince. It seemed that after the emperor had rested for 2 years, he had finally begun to lay down his chess pieces step by step. During these 2 months, the Overwatch Council and Dingzhou Army had forcefully stabilized the situation in Xiliang and the grasslands. The emperor finally had the spare time to prepare everything in the northeast. However, if the great prince was to become the commander of the Qing army's vanguard, control the 100,000 soldiers on the front lines, and become the powerful governor of the Northern Expedition Army, then he would have to accept another of the emperor's arrangements. He would take in a secondary Fei. When the troops were sent out, it would be the time for the great Wang Fei to leave court. The great prince is not like that, Fan Xian furrowed his brows and thought. Fan Xian furrowed his brows as he thought. The emperor had already paved the way for the great prince to lead the Qing army and fight on the battlefield. He was just waiting for the great prince to understand his painstaking efforts and walk this path. Although the great prince liked the battlefield, he probably wouldn't do such a thing. Thinking of how he would be forced to do such a thing under the emperor's pressure after he returned to the capital, Fan Xian felt annoyed and couldn't help but grunt. Although this grunt was very quiet, it gave Deng Ziyu and Mu Feng a fright. They didn't know what had happened. "It's nothing. Hurry and rest. We still have a long journey tomorrow." Fan Xian rubbed the spot between his brows and waved his hand at the two of them. After thinking for a bit, he asked Deng Ziyu to stay. He looked at Deng Ziyu and was silent for a moment. He then said, "You've been stationed in Shangjing for a long time. Do you know how the northern Qi people view Shi Fei?" During these 2 years, Shi Fei had been stationed in Sangzhou, leading the northern expedition camp to contend against the famous general Shang Shanhu. Although he had suffered some losses, he was not anxious or impatient. He had stabilized the situation very well. Deng Ziyu thought for a bit and then said, "General Shi Fei has always been Governor Wang's assistant in the Yanjing camp. His reputation was not very prominent. It was only after he went to the northern expedition camp 2 years ago that he gradually became known to the Qi people. Although there have been no major battles in the north and south of Zhangzhou these 2 years, he was still able to not panic under Shang Shanhu's coercion. Just this point alone proves that Shi Fei's personality leans toward the feminine side." "Feminine?" Fan Xian asked with some disagreement. If it was just the feminine side, why would the emperor have him shoulder such a heavy burden 2 years ago? Deng Ziyu knew what the commissioner was talking about. In the late autumn of the 7th year of the Qing calendar, the Dong Mountain incident and Jingdo rebelled. Everyone seemed to have overlooked the northern camp that Yan Xiaoyi had abandoned near Zhangzhou. No one thought of its importance. Fan Xian had never forgotten that when the emperor was still trapped on Dong Mountain, he had secretly sent a secret edict to Yanjing for the Yanjing camp to be ready at any time to take over the northern camp in Zhangzhou to prevent the northern Qi people from taking advantage of the chaos to invade. This was a very important mission. With Yan Xiaoyi's death, thousands of trusted soldiers were captured. If there were no capable generals holding the fort, the northern camp would probably truly rebel. At the time, the general responsible for the emperor's important edict was General Shi Fei. Not many people knew the specific process of how to subdue the northern camp's military morale. As the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, Fan Xian knew. In his opinion, the process of Shi Fei following the edict to subdue the Qing army was like a legend. General Shi Fei only brought a dozen trusted soldiers and entered the northern camp in Sangzhou. Holding the imperial edict in his hand, he easily took control of the northern camp. Faced with 100,000 soldiers, where did this general get his courage and ability to make the northern camp, which Yan Xiaoyi had run for many years, as docile as a warhorse? For someone to be able to do such a thing, he was definitely not just feminine. The pain between Fan Xian's brows grew. He kept feeling as if there was a shadow shrouding his mind. The emperor had decided to have the great prince lead the army on a northern expedition. This was expected. For a powerful figure like Shi Fei to not stay on the front lines but instead be transferred back to Jingdo to be the commander of the Jingdo garrison, who was he targeting? As early as when the former crown prince left for Nanzhao, Fan Xian had deduced that once the eldest princess's power melted like ice and snow, what welcomed him immediately would be the emperor's merciless reduction of power as well as the palace's merciless attacks on the older figures of the court. During these 2 years, the Overwatch Council's power had been reduced significantly. Fortunately, the emperor's trust in him grew with each passing day. No one in court dared to do anything to him. The elders that worried Fan Xian the most had also gained valuable experience from the Jingdo rebellion. Without waiting for the emperor to act, they automatically disappeared from the stage. His father had long resigned from his position as Minister of Revenue and returned to Danzhou to retire. Although Chen Pingping still held the position of director of the Overwatch Council, he had long stopped overseeing matters and handed all council affairs to Fan Xian and Yan Bingyun. Furthermore, he had long asked the emperor for his resignation. However, the emperor truly pitied the relationship between them and insisted on not allowing it. Of course, among the people of the older generation, the most tragic was his father-in-law in Wuzhou. During the rebellion in Jingdo, the previous prime minister Lin Ruofu had made a miscalculation and handed over all the people he had buried in the court to his good son-in-law. He had originally thought that he could make a comeback. Who would have thought that the emperor would safely return to the capital? All of this had become like a dreamlike bubble. Not only was it a bubble, the emperor was deeply afraid of the previous prime minister's dishonesty. During these 2 years he had dealt with the prime minister's former followers miserably. Although he didn't use any sinister methods, he had completely uprooted the last of the power Lin Ruofu had left in Jingdo. Concerning this matter, Fan Xian didn't even have the leeway to speak. He could only smile bitterly as he watched all of this. He watched as his father-in-law was terrified in Wuzhou and repeatedly secretly wrote to the emperor, begging for forgiveness. Fortunately, the emperor gave both Fan Xian and Lin Wan her face and did not continue to pursue the matter with Lin Ruofu. Thinking of it this way, the three old men the emperor intended to sweep clean had already consciously retreated to the back of the stage. The Qin court was like an iron bucket. Why had Shi Fei been moved back to Jingdou? Such a powerful figure was not left in the battle to unify the world but had been moved back to the emperor's side. Who was he targeting? Was it him? Fan Xian's heart dimmed. He no longer thought about these questions. Raising his head, he quietly said to Deng Ziyu, "Don't worry about the matters in Jingdou." He paused and then said, "No matter what you hear or know, don't worry about it. You have to remember, you are an official of the Overwatch Council and the Emperor's official. I have placed you in Xiliang now for the sake of the lives of the hundreds of millions of people in Qin Kingdom. If you do this well, everything will be fine." Deng Ziyu was the second person to enter the Qinian unit. He had been personally captured by Wang Qinian. Other than Geezer Wang, he was Fan Xian's most trusted aide. These few years, he had been in Shangjing in northern Qi as the head of the 4th Bureau stationed in northern Qi. He knew that the commissioner was promoting him and felt endless gratitude. Hearing the commissioner's inauspicious words, he couldn't help but be startled and speechless. His eyes were filled with worry. The three successive heads of the 4th Bureau's Northern Qi spy network in the Overwatch Council were Yan Bingyun, Wang Qinian, and Deng Ziyu. They were all Fan Xian's most capable assistants. If they didn't get into an accident like Wang Qinian, they would all become the top officials of the Overwatch Council in the future. Fan Xian looked at Deng Ziyu calmly. "The Xiliang matter is very important. You have to handle it well. After you return to the capital, you will hold the position of head of the 4th Bureau. This way it will be easier to get support from the other 7 bureaus. However, don't worry about the other areas for now. Let Yan Bingyun lead them. Do you understand?" "I understand." Deng Ziyu nodded. "Thank you for your grace. Don't let the Hu people take one step into my territory." Fan Xian stared into his eyes. "I have given up so many people and left you, whom I trust the most, in this desolate Xiliang road for at least 2 years. You know why. Don't disappoint me." Deng Ziyu's heart trembled. He knelt down on one knee and solemnly said, "I will not disappoint your hopes." Fan Xian nodded and didn't say anything more. It was Deng Ziyu's heart that was still filled with emotion. He had followed the commissioner for 5 years but had never seen him give instructions so seriously. What made him feel even more awed was that although Sir Fan Jr. was only a young man in his early 20s, when he gave instructions and did things, he was calm and steady like an old man who had floated in court for decades. He hesitated for a moment and then said, "Concerning Songji Xianling, the news that Songji Xianling was a Haitang would slowly spread out. At least for now, other than Fan Xian, only Deng Ziyu knew this secret." Hearing this request, Fan Xian fell silent and didn't reply for a long time. A dozen days later, the imperial envoy Fan Xian's group of carriages arrived outside Jingdou. 3 days ago, Fan Xian had given an order for all of the guards of honor and other eye-catching things to be removed. This trip to inspect Xiliang by imperial edict was just a formality. The secret plan was the most important. Additionally, there were some small troubles in Jingdou, so Fan Xian didn't want to be too ostentatious. Thus, the imperial envoy's guards of honor changed and became the carriages of the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council. There were no problems with the Overwatch Council's travel documents. The soldiers of the City Gate Department also didn't dare provoke them. The group of carriages did not wait for long outside the western city gate before heading inside. Fan Xian lifted a corner of the curtain and unconsciously looked out. He couldn't help but think of the first time he entered the capital and how he had caught a glimpse of Yi Ling, riding in on a horse. Yi Ling, should have already arrived in Dingzhou. 13th Wang would certainly report to the Fan Manor during the new year. However, he didn't know if she would follow. A comforting smile rose to Fan Xian's face. He thought of the spring that year. The girl wore a light-colored dress and a white deerskin hat. Her brows were like distant mountains and her eyes were clear and bright. Suddenly, a gray shadow charged past the side of the group of carriages and dangerously brushed past the carriage Fan Xian was in. This shadow was very fast and almost startled the horses of the Overwatch Council carriages. The situation was very dangerous. The swordsman of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council unconsciously gripped the handles of the metal drills and prepared to act at any moment. However, Fan Xian had already seen the gray shadow clearly and shook his head. It was just a little girl on a horse. There was no need to be so nervous. However, the girl on the horse charged very quickly and completely disregarded the safety of the commoners and farmers waiting outside the city gate. It made Fan Xian involuntarily furrow his brows. The girl on the horse had to be some noble young lady. Otherwise she wouldn't be so arrogant. Fan Xian stuck his head out of the window and narrowed his eyes at the girl charging through the city gate. He looked at the group startled by her horse, as well as an old farmer who had fallen to the ground in fright. His mood became terrible. There were many reasons for his terrible mood, but one of the most important was that the noble young lady was riding a horse in a dress like Yi Ling. She also wore a white deerskin hat on her head, and it was also the same as Yi Ling's. Whose family is this young lady? Her conduct is so unbearable, Fan Xian asked Mu Feng beside the carriage. Mu Feng's family worked in the first bureau of Jingdo and was familiar with the members of the noble families in Jingdo. Mu Feng looked at the disappearing horse in the distance and only shook his head to indicate that he didn't know. It was a member of the Qinian unit who had come out of the city to welcome them who said in a low voice, "It should be the young lady of the Wang family." The Wang family? Fan Xian's brows rose slightly. Other than the daughter of Yanjing Governor Wang Jikuan's family, which other Wang family in Jingdo dared to be so arrogant? 2 years had passed since the Jingdo rebellion. The Yanjing camp had performed exceptionally well in quelling the rebellion. Not only had they helped the emperor clear the entire Dongshan road, but they had also taken control of Yan Xiaoyi's northern expedition camp. Presently Wang Jikuan was far away in Yanjing, and Shi Fei had been transferred back to Jingdo. This was the so-called Yanjing faction in the military. It was a time of great imperial favor. It is the young lady of Governor Wang's family. It is said that the governor is grateful for the imperial favor and misses his old home in Jingdo, so he had this young lady return to Jingdo. The present commander of the Jingdo garrison, Shi Fei, was Governor Wang's subordinate in the past. This young lady calls him uncle. It is said that she liked the elegance of the young lady of Jingdo the most, so the member of the Qinian unit explained in a low voice. A good subordinate would always analyze the situation for the superior to prevent any unnecessary problems. She wants to learn from Yi Ling? The smile at the corner of Fan Xian's lips was slightly strange. The first time I saw Yi Ling outside the city gates, the people of Jingdo automatically made way for her. I have also never seen my disciple randomly wave a whip to chase people away. Looking at this scene, he gradually understood who the great Princess Secondary Fei was. His expression gradually darkened. Don't enter the palace first. Go around to Prince Huqing's manor. Chapter 6:14. The carriages with the clear Overwatch Council insignia smoothly entered Jingdo's West City Gate. At Xinjiku the carriages dispersed. The 2 carriages at the front merged inconspicuously into the flow of people on the streets of Jingdo and turned southwest. In a moment they left behind the liveliness behind them and entered the noble and quiet east side of the city. In the distance they could see the beasts of the Fan family's manor. The carriages did not stop. Instead they turned north. The closer they got to the royal palace, the quieter it became. They passed the area around the manor and King Jing's manor, whose doors had been closed for a long time, and came to the street where Prince Huqing's manor was. The carriage was still some distance from the manor's main gate. Fan Xian in the carriage could faintly hear the clamor outside the manor's main gate. It looked like a lively scene was happening there. He rubbed his itchy nose and thought to himself that he had guessed correctly again. The young lady of the Wang family's face was full of anger. She had indeed come to Prince Huqing's manor. As for the emperor's thoughts, Fan Xian had already guessed a bit after seeing the young lady of the Wang family, who was pretending to be Dongshi, outside the city gate. Since the great prince was being forced to take a secondary Fei in preparation for the future removal of Wang Fei, then this secondary Fei had to be of high birth. Only then would she be able to sit in the position of Wang Fei. Furthermore, this young lady was Wang Jikuan's beloved daughter. In the future, when the great prince led an army to the north, his father-in-law would lead the Yanjing camp to assist him. On the battlefield, the commander and deputy would not be hindered. It would also be of great benefit to the overall situation. As for whether or not the emperor would worry that the great prince and Wang Jikuan controlled too many soldiers if the young lady of the Wang family actually became Prince Huqing's Fei, that was a problem for the future. With the lesson of the second prince, Fan Xian did not think that the emperor would give his sons too many opportunities to let their imaginations run wild. The daughter of an important military official marrying a prince, the prince should be secretly cautious. Otherwise, who knew if he would end up like Li Qingze and be sold out cleanly when things came to a head. Fan Xian couldn't resist laughing mockingly. The emperor's arrangements were far-sighted. If the great prince wanted to lead an army to conquer northern Qi, the great Wang Fei's identity as a northern Qi princess was indeed an obstacle that was difficult to get around. However, Fan Xian felt a strong revulsion toward this kind of arrangement. Putting aside the relationship between him and the great princess of northern Qi, just seeing the vile young lady of the Wang family at the city gate made Fan Xian develop a deep suspicion toward the emperor's vision. Picking a daughter-in-law for yourself, you have to pick a good one. A woman like this, if she really entered the Wang Fu, I'm afraid the entire Fu will not be at peace. Fan Xian immediately denied his silent criticism of the emperor. The emperor never cared much about women. Marriage alliances were just some transactions. As for this woman's character and whether or not she would bring benefits to his son, he did not care at all. As for the manor becoming restless because of the young lady of the Wang family, perhaps this was the effect that the emperor wanted to see. The great prince's status was noble. Prince Heching's manor took up half of the long street. The eastern part of the city was silent. No one dared to laugh at the great prince in such an important place. Although there was some noise outside the front door of the manor, other than the 2 carriages of the Overwatch Council, no one else was spying on them. "My lord, it's a little inconvenient to go there now. Why don't we return to the estate first?" Although Fan Xian had come to Xiliang in the name of an imperial envoy, in reality, he was carrying out a secret edict. He didn't need to return to the capital to enter the palace to reply to the edict. Mu Feng watched as Prince Heching's manor door turned into a market. He thought to himself, the prince must have lost some face. If the commissioner came to visit now, it would probably be inconvenient. However, Mu Feng was still not as good as Wang Qinian at guessing Fan Xian's intentions. Fan Xian had come to Prince Heching's manor to watch the excitement. He listened intently in the carriage. He had already understood where the excitement outside Prince Heching's manor door came from. The young lady of the Wang family's voice was so loud that it was difficult not to understand. Although the emperor's edict for the great prince to take on a secondary fei had not been made public, he had already done some work in secret. Those who should know this news had long known. As the people involved, the great prince and Wang Jikuan knew even better. Yesterday, the new commander of the Jingdo garrison, Shi Fei, had personally invited the great prince to a banquet. At the banquet, he had orchestrated a chance encounter between the great prince and the young lady of the Wang family. Unexpectedly, the great prince was a straightforward person. The moment he saw the young lady of the Wang family, it was like he had seen a ghost. He fled and did not give the other party any chance to speak. The young lady of the Wang family had lived in Yanjing. As the daughter of the governor, when had she ever suffered such humiliation and grievance? Particularly when she thought about how she would have to pitifully be a secondary fei after entering the manor, she held her anger in her heart. She clearly knew that it was the palace's edict for her to marry the great prince, so why was she angry at her? The young lady of the Wang family could not understand it no matter how she thought about it. As an admirer of the previous pride of Jingdo Yilingyo, she had a lot of admiration for this prince who had once led troops to conquer the western frontier for many years. Perhaps she had been incited by a serving girl, or perhaps her own thoughts had burrowed into a dead end, but she had completely disregarded etiquette and ridden into the capital alone to run to the manor. After Shi Fei learned of this, he did not dare to be careless. He quickly sent people to chase after her. However, when they reached Prince Heching's manor, no one could do anything to this young lady or pull her back. The reason the young lady used was also laughable. She said she had come to Prince Heching's manor to visit Wang Fei. Fan Xian had to admit that although this reason was absurd and laughable, the interactions between the women of Jingdo's nobility were considered normal. Even Fan Xian had not thought that Wang Fei would be as straightforward as her man. She closed the doors tightly and refused to accept guests. She didn't even say that the master of the manor was away. She just straightforwardly said that the manor had business to attend to and could not receive guests. The young lady of the Wang family felt even more wronged. She had already willingly lowered her status to come and visit a foreign woman, yet she still used her status to close the door. Thus, she began to make a ruckus outside the manor. This woman had Yi Ling-er's straightforwardness, but she did not have Yi Ling-er's sense of propriety. Making a ruckus was truly a headache. Her personal soldiers and guards looked at this scene in terror. Looking at Prince Heching's tightly closed doors, they felt anger in their hearts. They thought, what kind of place is this? This is Prince Heching's manor. Even if the young lady could do as she pleased in Yanjing, how could she act like this in Jingdo? If she truly angered the prince in the manner, who knew what he would do? Fan Xian looked at the scene in the distance with slight disgust. He thought to himself, if the palace and Shifei truly had intentions, how could they not be able to stop a spoiled and barbaric woman from acting rudely? He was afraid that the scene today was purposely done by someone with ulterior motives. They wanted to make the great prince unhappy and make a ruckus all over the city. In the end, the emperor would speak to sort out the matter and have the great prince suffer in silence. At that time, the emperor could lightly say, "The young lady of the Wang family has deep feelings for you and has already come to your door. Are you not going to take responsibility?" Another example would be, the people of Jingdo all know of this matter. As the eldest son of the royal family, how could you not care about the face of the royal family? I will give you half a month to settle this matter and bring that woman into the family. Then I won't blame you. They were all small tricks, shameful methods, but they were the ones Fan Xian was most familiar with. He furrowed his brows and thought to himself, the great prince was very close to him. This was a difficult matter. At the very least, he would have to handle the shameful matter in front of him. He ordered Mu Feng, go knock on the door. 2 black carriages drove toward the gate of the mansion. The wheels creaked as if they were a discordant accompaniment to the noble lady's unrelenting and shrewish voice at the gate of the mansion. There were about 30 people surrounding the front door of the manor. They were all family warriors the Wang family had brought back from Yanjing. There were also housekeepers and servants the Jingdo garrison had sent to the young lady. An old housekeeper was crying and begging the young lady to leave some face for the old master and not make a scene at the front door of the manor. Otherwise, when the family became the joke of Jingdo, how could the Wang family continue to stay in Jingdo? When the 2 carriages neared the front door of the manor, the housekeeper quickly shut his mouth. In any case, his young lady was not willing to listen to him. The family warriors and servants stared warily at the 2 black carriages. They thought that the young lady was making a scene. If someone saw it and it got out, it would probably not be good. Only the young lady of the Wang family had 1 foot on the stone lion and was pointing at the front door of the manor. She was still displaying the power of a starlet facing the ocean and cursing endlessly. Fan Xian's voice came out of the carriage, "Whose family is this girl? Making a scene in the middle of the street, do you have any manners?" These words were said with the arrogance of one's age and experience. It was also a phrase that Fan Xian had thought of after pondering for a long time in the carriage. After these words were said, the expressions of the people surrounding the front door of the manor changed dramatically. These words appeared normal, but they were unusually vicious. Once they opened, they brought the young lady's current actions to the teachings of the family. It appeared to be criticizing this woman, but in reality, it was directed at the person behind her. A family warrior stared at the 2 carriages and forcefully suppressed his anger. I wonder which official has arrived. Other than the young lady, there were no idiots in the Wang and Shi families. Since the newcomer dared to speak so boldly in front of Prince Heching's manor, he had a background. This family warrior had already noticed the purposefully revealed mark on the carriage and knew that the other party was an official of the Overwatch Council. In the entire Qing court, there were very few officials who dared to not give face to the Yanjing faction of the military. However, the officials of the Overwatch Council had the confidence to do so because they had a very protective old ancestor above them. Although the old ancestor in the wheelchair had gradually retired, an even more protective little ancestor had appeared. Furthermore, this little ancestor was even more ruthless in his actions and had a deeper background. He had only been in the capital for 5 years, and he had already killed a number of ministers. Even people like the crown prince and eldest princess had fallen to his hands. With the protection of such an ancestor, it was understandable that the officials of the Overwatch Council dared to be so arrogant. Before this family warrior returned to the capital, he had received a secret order from the governor that he had to endure and conduct himself in Jingdo. In particular, he could not offend the Overwatch Council. Hearing the person in the carriage mocking the Wang family's teachings, this family warrior was still able to forcefully suppress his anger and maintain his calm as he asked. The person in the carriage did not immediately answer his question. A subordinate lifted the curtain and Fan Xian walked down from the carriage. Among the crowd, he walked to the tightly closed doors of Prince Heching's manor and turned his head to glance at the woman standing on the stone lion. Although the young lady of the Wang family did things irascibly and her tone was harsh, there was something strange about her. It was clear that outsiders had already arrived, but it was as if she did not see them. She still felt wronged and angrily yelled at the manor until she was watched by this young Overwatch Council official for a long time. She glared fiercely at Fan Xian and scolded, "What are you looking at? Close your dog eyes, After these words were said, everyone fell silent. The Overwatch Council subordinates behind Fan Xian stared coldly at the young lady on the stone lion. Mu Feng'er's expression twisted. It was as if he could go up at any moment and give this woman a beating. The family warrior and housekeeper realized that something was wrong and quickly moved forward, separating Fan Xian and the young lady. The housekeeper lowered his head and repeatedly apologized. The expression of the family warrior was also very awkward. Fan Xian looked at this scene and was increasingly certain of his guess. The young lady of the Wang family must have been provoked by someone to come to make trouble. The Wang family warriors probably still did not know the reason. With such a steady subordinate, only then would Wang Jikuan be at ease to allow his spoiled daughter to return to the capital. How could he have allowed this young lady to charge into Prince Heching's manor? Fan Xian looked at the housekeeper and asked, "Which family are you from?" The housekeeper saw that his bearing was extraordinary. Although he didn't know what rank of official he was, Overwatch Council officials often had titles other than court positions. He did not dare to slight him and said, "I am the housekeeper of the Wang family. I have just returned from Yanjing. The young lady has been in Yanjing for a long time and does not know the ways of Jingdo. If she has offended you in any way, please forgive her." Young Lady Wang listened to the two of them speak and pulled her foot back from the stone lion. She scolded, "Who is this? Is there a need to say soft words to him?" The old housekeeper's mouth tasted bitter. The old master had long ordered that he should behave with his tail between his legs in Jingdo, but the young lady had lost her mind for some reason. She had broken free of her family's obstruction and charged into the manor. She had actually called this young official something. Jingdo was not Yanjing. The water was much deeper. Any person on the street could have a terrifying background. Yanjing? Fan Xian asked with slight surprise. Governor Wang's family? Young Lady Wang stared at Fan Xian and said, "You know my family? And who are you?" Fan Xian didn't even glance at her. Facing the housekeeper and family soldier, he warmly said, "Quickly persuade your young lady to go back. The palace hasn't even issued an edict. If she comes to make a ruckus like this, how will she face others?" The housekeeper and the family soldier repeatedly agreed. They only looked at each other but didn't go up to help their young lady. They had already tried a few times earlier and couldn't do anything. Fan Xian was slightly startled. Only now did he notice that there were a few whip marks on the old housekeeper's face. Although the force was not deep, blood was gradually seeping out. He turned his head to look and saw that the unruly young lady of the Wang family was holding a horse whip in her left hand. Involuntarily, his expression darkened. He should have treasured such a loyal housekeeper, yet she had used a whip to beat him. His impression of this woman became even worse. Coincidentally, the young lady of the Wang family saw that Fan Xian was ignoring her question and putting on an arrogant expression. She was even more angry. Having been locked outside Prince Heching's manor for half a day, she had already lost a great deal of face. Now an unknown young official dared to give her a hard time. How could she endure it? The anger in her heart flared. Tears welled up in her eyes. Her left hand waved and a whip came crashing down. The horse whip whistled down and was about to touch the tip of Fan Xian's nose. Fan Xian only looked at the woman and thought mockingly in his heart that in this rebirth, the women he had met all had their own beauty. When he was in Danzhou, he couldn't find a bully even if he wanted to. Unexpectedly, he had finally seen a tender fish's eye. With a cracking sound, a few gusts of cold wind flashed past. The horse whip in the young lady's hand broke into 4 pieces in front of Fan Xian and fell to the ground. How could the swordsman of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council allow an unruly woman to harm their commissioner? With a flash of cold light, 6 or 7 metal rods surrounded the young lady of the Wang family. The housekeeper and the family soldier had no idea that this young Overwatch Council official would have so many aces at his side. They were shocked. Worried about the young lady's safety, they all stood in front of her to protect her. If this had happened in the past, they probably would have guessed Fan Xian's true identity. However, everyone in Jingdo knew that the little ancestor of the Overwatch Council was still on his way back from patrolling Shiliang on behalf of the Emperor, so they hadn't thought of this for a moment. Both sides were ready to fight at any moment outside the manor. Although the swordsmen of the Overwatch Council were terrifying, the family soldiers Yanjing's Wang Jikuan had sent to protect his daughter were not idle either. Most importantly, the front doors of Prince Heching's manor were still tightly shut. Fan Xian did not get angry. On the contrary, he smiled merrily as he looked at the young lady of the Wang family and said, "You can continue to curse. I won't stop you." However, in the future I will go ask Wang Jikuan how he raised a strange person like you. Someday I will also go ask Shifei if he, as your uncle, doesn't have time to teach you and if you want me to teach you. In the Qing court, there were no more than 3 young people who dared to directly call Governor Wang and Commander Shi by their names. Other than the 2 princes, there was only that young man. The housekeeper and the family soldier met each other's eyes and saw the shock and regret in each other's hearts. Even their lips began to tremble. Unfortunately, the young lady of the Wang family was stupid. Hearing the other party directly call her father by his name, she said in a great anger, "Who do you think you are? How dare you make irresponsible remarks to father and say you will discipline me?" Fan Xian glanced at her and smiled coldly. "I can even subdue a wild horse like Yi Ling, much less a lame donkey like you." After saying this, he paid no more attention to the terrified and uneasy figures of the Wang and Shi families. Directly climbing up the steps, he banged on the front door of Prince Huqing's manor and angrily said, "Have you seen enough? Hurry up and open the door." No matter how stupid the young lady of the Wang family was at this moment, she finally knew the other party's identity. Her heart was a mess for a moment. Tears flowed freely from her eyes. However, the tears flowed without rhyme or reason. The front door of the manor was finally pulled open, a small opening, but no one appeared. It looked like the manor was only prepared to let Fan Xian in. They were still on guard against the young lady of the Wang family, this monstrous figure. Fan Xian suddenly turned his head and looked at the young lady of the Wang family. "You like the great prince?" No matter how open-minded the Qing people were, asking about such a private matter between a man and a woman in front of so many officials and servants was going too far. The housekeeper and family soldier gritted their teeth. Disregarding Fan Xian's identity, they prepared to scold him. Unexpectedly, the young lady of the Wang family gritted her teeth and said in a loud voice, "I like him. What about it? What about it? I just want to tell you that if I say it won't work, it won't work. Even if it works, it won't work." He paused and then said with slight mockery, "I've been scolding him for a while. Do you want to come in for a cup of tea?" The young lady of the Wang family froze where she was. Unconsciously, she prepared to flee back to Uncle Shi's home. She felt that the young noble in front of her was truly strange and powerful. It made her fearful for no reason. A moment later, she steeled her heart and threw down the broken end of the horsewhip. Stopping the housekeeper's attempts to stop her, she followed behind Fan Xian and entered the manor she had dreamed of for a long time. However, the way she entered this time was somewhat special. The front doors of the manor closed tightly behind the 2 of them. Regardless of whether it was the subordinates of the Overwatch Council or the worried family soldiers and housekeepers of the Wang and Shi families, they were all blocked outside the manor. No one knew what Fan Xian was thinking by bringing the young lady into the manor. Fan Xian was surprised that the young lady of the Wang family dared to look him in the eye and bravely, or rather recklessly, follow him into the manor. Amidst the surprise, a strange feeling rose in his heart. He thought that although this woman was unruly by nature and did not care for her servants at all, compared to Yi Ling, her posture of cupping one's heart was much uglier. At least there was something good about Yi Ling. It was directness that was very different from other young ladies in Jingdo. The palace's edict has yet to come out. Have you thought about your father and Commander Shi's feelings by coming here to make a ruckus? Fan Xian turned his head and chased the housekeeper of the manor to the side. Looking at the young lady of the Wang family, he coldly said, "As a son, filial piety is the most important. Do you know your mistake by making a ruckus today?" The young lady of the Wang family stared into Fan Xian's eyes in shock. She knew the identity of the person in front of her and his powerful abilities. She also knew that her favorite young lady of the Yi family was his anonymous disciple. However, she still had not thought that the moment she entered the manor, his first words would be like her father's and begin to lecture her. Her eyes reddened and she burst into tears. Sobbing, she said, the king called me shameless." Chapter 6:15. Fan Xian lowered his head and moved closer in front of the young lady of the Wang family. He looked at her closely until the bawling woman became uncomfortable. Only then did he say seriously, "Do you know how to write the word shame?" The young lady of the Wang family gritted her teeth and stared fiercely into Fan Xian's eyes. If the king said she did not know shame, she would be hurt, disappointed, and angry. However, she felt even more wronged. That was why she had come to the manor to seek justice from the king. However, for Sir Fan Jr. to say she did not know shame made it difficult for her to accept. Fan Xian straightened his body and gave a glance to the nervous servants in the manor beside him to have them retreat further. Only then did he open his mouth to ask the young lady of the Wang family, "Do you think that making such a ruckus today is very reasonable?" "I just don't know. The king and I have only met once in Uncle's manor. How can I be shameless?" The young lady of the Wang family bit her lip. Her eyes were red like a rabbit ready to pounce and bite at any moment. She stared angrily into Fan Xian's eyes and said, "Yesterday I didn't dare to make a sound at the banquet. I didn't even dare to say a word. In the end I was called shameless by you. Today I came to make a fuss and let you see what true shamelessness looks like." Fan Xian felt something was strange in his heart, but he couldn't be bothered to probe deeper. He just couldn't stand the sight of a king being forced by both the palace and an unruly woman to shut himself in. Thus, he had revealed himself and was prepared to teach this woman a lesson on behalf of Governor Wang. However, at this moment, an idea flashed through his mind and he thought of a seemingly good way out. Being watched by Fan Xian's quiet and silent gaze, the young lady's voice became lower and lower. She gradually couldn't vent anymore. She felt like she had seen a ghost. Why was it that when she saw this young noble, her aura immediately disappeared without a trace? No matter how much she cheered herself on, she didn't dare to yell at him. In reality, it was still a matter of power. Fan Xian's position was high and important. Within the Qin kingdom, no one doubted he was the #1 person behind the emperor. In addition, 2 years ago, after he had broken the heartbreaking arrow with a stunning spear, his temperament had broken through again. He had long stood firmly in the realm of the upper 9th level and faintly became a first-rate figure below the great grandmaster. With power and aura added together, even if he was facing Governor Wang or even the ruthless Yan Xiaoyi of the past, Fan Xian would not have any thoughts of giving way. Now, without the chest by his side, he reckoned that he could still confront Yan Xiaoyi head-on, not to mention that the opponent was a spoiled girl who only knew how to make a scene. Sister Yi, unruliness toward whom? The young lady of the Wang family opened her eyes wide and did not notice Fan Xian's last words. Fan Xian was startled and incomparably angry. Other than unruliness toward him, who else could she be toward? Shortly after, his expression darkened. After purposely being silent for a moment, he said darkly, "It is not an easy matter to marry the prince. If you can't change your bad habits, there is no way." The young lady of the Wang family was frightened by his expression and unconsciously prepared to flee out of the manor. However, hearing the word marry, her heart burned like a fire. However, she knew that her temper was truly too bad. If she could change it, the teaching nannies the palace had sent these days would not have such a headache. Speaking of which, it was funny. After Fan Xian's mockery, this woman actually became a bit more self-aware. "I am willing to change." Her face was completely covered in tears. It is easy to change mountains and rivers, but it is difficult to change a person's nature. Fan Xian stared at her and smiled slightly. "Take me as your teacher. I will cut off all of your thorns." The young lady of the Wang family felt a chill in her heart. She was terrified and also a glimmer of anger. Although he was the emperor's illegitimate child and had unparalleled power, he was, after all, only a young man in his 20s. How could he have the nerve to be her teacher? She immediately remembered that the person in front of her had been the teacher of the third prince and Sister Ye's teacher. Although he was young, he had already taken 2 students. One was her idol, and the other should be the future emperor of Qin Kingdom. Now, he was willing to take her as a disciple? Fan Xian did not give her any time to think. With his hands behind his back, he walked coldly toward the depths of the manor. The young lady gritted her teeth, lifted her skirt and ran after him. Running behind Fan Xian, she was very careful. She finally understood that perhaps Sir Fan Jr. was willing to take her as a student because he truly wanted to create an opportunity for her to enter the manor. The emperor was prepared to have Sir Fan Jr., after he returned to the capital, persuade the prince to take a secondary fey. This inside information had already spread. The young lady knew that whether or not she could enter this manor depended largely on Fan Xian. Hearing that he was willing to take her as a disciple, how could she not be happy? Fan Xian heard the sound of her footsteps and didn't turn his head. Straightforwardly, he said, "If you want to be my student, you have to be prepared to be beaten by me." The young lady was furious. She had lived for so long. Who dared to beat her? Immediately after, she thought of her own happiness and couldn't help but close her mouth in sadness. "Apologize to your housekeeper. Go find the people who were injured by your horse when they entered the city. Pay the medical fees and apologize." "Yes, sir." Don't let me find out that after you apologize, you have thoughts of revenge in your heart. Don't let this kind of thing happen again. Yes, sir. Tomorrow have General Sure send someone to bring you to the Fan Manor. Take 10 whips and then this first matter will be over. The young lady of the Wang family stood dumbfounded. She had thought that she had already given Sir Fan Jr. enough face by suppressing her anger, agreeing to apologize to the housekeeper, and comforting those lowly commoners. Unexpectedly, this person was actually going to use a whip to beat her. You're shameless. In Prince Hetching's quiet study, the great prince pointed at Fan Xian's nose and cursed angrily in a trembling voice. Across from him, Fan Xian did not show any weakness. With a face full of anger, he slapped off the great prince's finger and cursed, "You're the shameless one." The great prince said Fan Xian was shameless because he had brought the young lady of the Wang family into the manor and chased her to Wang Fei's residence. Furthermore, the great prince had heard clearly the conversation between Fan Xian and the young lady along the way. Fan Xian had taken her as a student and pulled the relationship between him and the Wang family closer. This made him very angry and confused. These few days the palace had been secretly urging him to take a secondary fei. They had even picked someone for him. Although the great prince had forcefully resisted a number of times, in the end, no one dared to directly challenge the emperor's authority. His mood was in an unusually violent state. Particularly yesterday, the new commander of the Jingdo garrison, Shi Fei, had specially invited the great prince to a banquet. No matter what, he had to give this face. He had not expected that after 3 rounds of the banquet, Shi Fei would act like a matchmaker and invite the bashful young lady of the Wang family. The great prince immediately knew what was going on. In a rage, he flicked his sleeves and left, not leaving any face for the people from Yanjing. What made the great prince most angry was the attitude Fan Xian had displayed earlier. He had been vexed these past few days, but he had thought that once Fan Xian returned, his shockingly capable brother would certainly be able to think of a way to satisfy both sides. He would be able to cancel this marriage and make the emperor happier. At the beginning, the scene at the gates of the manor had made the great prince very happy. He thought that a crafty and unruly person like the young lady of the Wang family would indeed need someone as sinister as Fan Xian to deal with. He had not expected that Fan Xian's attitude would undergo a drastic change later on. Not only did he bring the young lady into the manor, he had also taken her as a student. How am I shameless? The great prince roared at Fan Xian. He had called Fan Xian shameless because he had disregarded their brotherhood and dragged him into the abyss. He had not expected that Fan Xian would dare to call him shameless. You're not shameless? Fan Xian's face was full of anger. What is the point of dragging me into the mess of your own manor? You dared to offend the emperor and the generals in Yanjing. Do you want me to offend them as well? She's just a silly little girl. With the means you and your husband have, you can easily get rid of her at any time. You even had to eagerly send the horse to me for me to handle. You too forcefully dragged me into the water. Isn't that shameless? The great prince was speechless. After discussing it with Wang Fei for a dozen days, he felt that in the current situation, it seemed that only Fan Xian could resolve this problem. He indeed had thoughts of dragging him into the water. He coughed and said guiltily, "In any case, father was prepared to have you come to the manor to be a lobbyist. I'll pull you to my side first so that we can argue more in the future." "But I'm not a matchmaker," Fan Xian scolded without good humor. The great prince said seriously, "But you are an official of Taichang Temple." Fan Xian shook his head helplessly. The official of Taichang Temple was in charge of the matters of the royal family. As for the marriages of the princes, and dukes, it was up to him to handle. The two of them fell silent at the same time. After experiencing the Jingdo rebellion 2 years ago, this pair of brothers were no longer like before, only relying on their relationship with Chen Pingping and Lady Ning to stand shoulder to shoulder. They truly had the friendship of killing enemies together and the feeling of living and dying together. In these 2 years, their relationship could not be better. What do you mean by taking her as a student? The great prince stared into Fan Xian's eyes. You know I don't want to take on a secondary fei. Let's not talk about this for now. Let's talk about the young lady of the Wang family. Fan Xian lowered his head and thought for a moment. He then said, "This girl's family name is Wang Tong'er. She is Governor Wang's precious daughter. At yesterday's banquet, she did not lose her composure like she did today. Why did you call her shameless?" The great prince said, "Although this girl's personality is rumored to not be good, I've only seen her once. As a prince, how could I rashly criticize the daughter of a general?" Fan Xian smiled self-mockingly and said, "I knew you weren't that kind of person. These words were gossip that the teaching nannies in the palace passed through the serving girls of the Wang family to Miss Wang's ears. That is why she came to make such a fuss today. It is clear that the palace wants her to make a fuss so that the entire city knows, and Wang Fei is secretly angry. He raised his head and looked at the great prince. She is, after all, a daughter of the Wang family. Her status is sufficiently noble. Furthermore, as you know, ever since the Dong Mountain incident, the Qing court's attitude toward Northern Qi has undergone a great change. Everyone's attitude toward Wang Fei is not what it was before. The great prince nodded silently. Wang Fei had not been willing to leave the manor these 2 years because she did not want to endure the hostile gazes of the common people of the Qing kingdom. Northern Qi had participated in the plot to assassinate the emperor. No one could escape this hatred. Thus, if this matter truly becomes a scandal and the emperor directly decrees a marriage, I'm afraid all the civil and military officials in court will support it. Wang Fei must abdicate. All the civil and military officials in court. The great prince furrowed his brows and refuted. This Miss Wang's reputation is not very good. Fan Xian smiled coldly and said, "Who are you? You are the eldest son of the royal family, the only prince who can lead a northern expedition. You are the pride of the Qing kingdom. Never mind Miss Wang, as long as your Wang Fei can change from a northern Qi person to a Qing person. Even if she is a sow, these officials, scholars, and people will carry her into the manor for you." The great prince's heart chilled. It was as if he saw a large white sow tied to a pole with red ribbons around her body being carried into the manor amidst the sound of trumpets and swona. I already understood on the way here. Regardless of whether it is you or me, neither of us can stop this matter. There are only 2 of us. How can we oppose the entire court? Fan Xian smiled self-mockingly. You want to reject the marriage and also make the emperor happy. This is impossible. The great prince sat down dejectedly. He had completely lost the heroic spirit he had when he attacked Western Hu. He muttered to himself, "Do I really have to take a secondary fei? If you don't want the matter to become too big and the emperor to be angry and directly depose your Wang Fei because of jealousy of not having an heir, then taking a secondary fei is inevitable. At least it can drag on for a while." Fan Xian looked at him with pity, thinking that a prince leading an army was indeed much more miserable than he was. "Look at all the officials in the court," he said in a comforting voice. "Who doesn't have 3 wives and 4 concubines? Even that old Shu Wu has a few concubines in their 20s in his manor. Wang Fei is a reasonable and courteous person. She won't argue too much about the matter of taking a secondary fei. Multiple wives? Why don't I see you taking a few more?" the great prince said angrily. He then fell silent. He knew that the matter of taking a secondary fei could not be dragged on. He also knew that Fan Xian had purposely not brought it up. The so-called taking a secondary fei was actually a preparation to depose Wang Fei in the future. Although the great prince and Wang Fei were a political marriage during the honeymoon period of the 2 countries, the 2 of them were harmonious and had a good relationship. If Wang Fei was truly deposed, he would not accept it no matter what. Although Wang Tong'er and I have only met for the first time today, we have spoken a few words. Seeing the change in the great prince's expression, Fan Xian said evenly, "If you want to take a secondary fei, she is the best choice. Otherwise, my attitude would not have changed so much." Just this. The great prince suddenly stood up. In the end, he still had a generous personality and resisted scolding that woman. Chapter 616. Even though Wang Tong'er had blocked the front door of the manor and scolded him for a long time, the great prince still perfectly maintained the image of a mature man. Up until now, he had not said a single harsh word to the young girl. Although the other party was the daughter of the governor of Yanjing, the first prince was a legitimate prince. The difference in their statuses made it so that he did not have to consider too much. However, he still tried his best to maintain a calm state of mind. After hearing Fan Xian's words, he did not follow and scold the girl for being a scoundrel. He only furrowed his brows and said, "Who knows why you took her on as a student?" "I don't believe you can't guess," Fan Xian said with a smile. "Of course, I'm worried that after the manor already has a tigress, there will be another little leopard. If I can teach this young lady of the Wang family to be well-informed, well-mannered, and well-behaved, what are you afraid of taking her on as a disciple?" After going around and around, Fan Xian was still urging the great prince to take a secondary fei. The great prince said angrily, "I really don't know where your usually admirable foresight has gone. How dare you say this silly girl is not a good choice?" "What's not good?" Fan Xian's smile faded and he said seriously, I don't need to remind you. You should know that your roots are in the military. She is Wang Jikuan's daughter. If you take her on as a secondary Fei, your relationship with the military will certainly become closer. Don't forget, although your prestige in the military is high, the Western Expedition Army has long been broken up. You cannot return to Dingzhou, and your position as commander of the Imperial Army has also been removed. This is my father's intention. The great prince's expression became cold. Unexpectedly, your calculations are as good as my father's. Fan Xian raised his brows and sat down. Everyone can see the emperor's intentions clearly. There has to be a woman entering the manor and keeping an eye on the position of Wang Fei at all times. If you don't want Wang Fei to be deposed, then having Wang Tong enter the manor is better than having someone else. The great prince stared at him with confusion. He wondered why Fan Xian's intentions had changed so much. He firmly believed that Wang Tong was the best choice. Wang Tong's background was very deep. She had the military and Yanjing factions supporting her. Additionally, the emperor was secretly letting her go. Once this woman entered the manor, she would immediately threaten Wang Fei's position. The reason why I said that Wang Tong is a good choice is because this girl really likes you. Fan Xian said, furthermore, although this young lady's personality is a bit shrewish and vicious, she is a girl who walks the path of slashing and killing. This kind of person looks troublesome, but it is actually easier to deal with. You don't want the new secondary Fei in the manor to be like the eldest princess, who appears weak on the surface but is actually incomparably powerful in the dark. The first prince thought about it and realized that this was indeed the case. Wang Tong dared to come to the prince's mansion to cause trouble before the edict from the palace had been issued. She was indeed not a woman who walked the path of a seductive woman. But he thought about it again and still frowned and said, but she is only a 15-year-old girl, she is not sensible at all. What if after entering the palace she holds a kitchen knife every day? What should we do? His Majesty means that we can't openly resist. Fan Xian looked into his eyes and quietly advised, but we can try to deal with it in another way. As for whether or not Wang Tong will cause trouble in the future, that will depend on how I, her teacher, teach her and how you two respond. He took a sip of tea and suddenly felt that his heart was becoming harder and harder. After a self-mocking smile he said, it's still that old saying. Wang Tong likes you, so as long as she enters the manor, she will treat you as her sky. Whether a person is satisfied or not depends mainly on what they wish for. If it was another young lady, perhaps she would not be satisfied if she didn't become a Wang Fei. I think Wang Tong will probably be satisfied if she marries you. The first prince glanced at him non-committally and lightly said, how can you be so sure of a girl's thoughts? If we really take her into the manor and she causes chaos in the manor, are you going to clean it up? I'll do it. Fan Xian shrugged and said, when it comes to a girl's thoughts, there is no other man in the world who understands them better than me. You have to have confidence in me. The great prince thought that Fan Xian's words were not arrogant. Just looking at how many young girls had been mesmerized by Story of the Stone and his glorious accomplishments in his life, not only had he mesmerized his beloved sister Qin to death, but he had also mesmerized the saint girl of northern Qi's Tianyi Dao to the point of losing her soul. From this, one could tell that his judgment was reasonable. I just don't understand why Miss Wang has to keep an eye on me. You have to know that we only met once at Shifei's banquet. The great prince stared at Fan Xian and said, to like someone at first sight. If the other party was a monster like you, it might be possible. Women and men are two different creatures. Fan Xian patted his shoulder with pity and said, if a man like you can't understand, then don't think about it. The great prince spat angrily and immediately thought of a problem. For a busy official like you to take Wang Tong as a female student, it is not just because of me. Fan Xian smiled awkwardly and said, you already understand, so what are you asking? You have to know that I'm not like you. Other than the Black Knights, I have nothing else. It's not wrong to have a good relationship with the military elders. I don't want a second Qin family that hates me to the bone to appear. The great prince paused for a moment and then sighed. Yizhong's girl has always listened to you. Now you won't even let Wang Jikuan's daughter go. Truly, these words sound awkward. Fan Xian rubbed his nose and laughingly scolded, I'm not an animal. These two are your brother's wives. You can't speak blindly. But they are also your female students. The great prince said with a deep smile. Additionally, Hongqing is in Dingzhou. Although father has always strictly forbidden you from participating in the military, no matter how you think about it, you will soon have connections to the armies of 3 roads. Your calculations are not any less than father's. You underestimate me. Although Fan Bingyun once said that I seem to be conquering the world through conquering women, with 2 roads of armies and the power of the Yi family, I am not stupid enough to want to use 2 female students to influence anything. Fan Xian smiled. However, I am willing to improve my relationship with the military. As he said these words, Fan Xian's emotions were complicated. He had come to Jingdo and entered the complicated Jingdo officialdom. He had already influenced the world for a full 5 years. His efforts to reach out to the Qing military had all, without exception, come to nothing. Although the emperor's wariness toward him seemed to have lessened greatly and had Li Hongqing, who was on good terms with him, become the general of Dingzhou, if Fan Xian truly wanted to fight his way into the military, it would still be difficult. For example, the Jiaozhou Navy. Fan Xian had once used Su Maocai's help to gradually arrange for his trusted aides to enter. He was prepared to wait for the old Qin family to rebel and then secretly take over the Jiaozhou Navy's power. He had not thought that the emperor would not let go of this slight change and directly knocked Su Maocai into the dust. Although the emperor had mercifully left Su Maocai's life for Fan Xian's sake, the entire Jiaozhou Navy was moving further and further away from Fan Xian's hands. Furthermore, Hou Jichang, who Fan Xian had remained in Jiaozhou, had done 2 years of useless work because of this matter and wasted a great deal of time. It was becoming more and more difficult to advance on the official road. Presently, not only was he far from Yang Wanli's reputation in the Ministry of Works, he was even much worse than Qing Jialin, who had already become the Suzhou Zhizhou. Hou Jichang was the person Fan Xian admired the most of Fan Xian's 4 disciples. That was why he had entrusted Jiaozhou, such an important place, to him. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian's one wrong move had caused this Jingdo talent, who had once been as famous as He Zongwei, to still be able to endure his official reputation in the remote Jiaozhou. Presently, the emperor's favor and trust toward Fan Xian could not be any greater, but he was still on guard against him entering the military. This reality made Fan Xian's heart beat like a drum. He didn't know if the emperor knew something or if the emperor often had nightmares about the incident 20 years ago. Additionally, Su Maocai was an old member of the Quanzhou Navy, so he was still wary of his son, Fan Xian. You need to have a good relationship with the military. I don't. The great prince's words pulled Fan Xian out of his thoughts. He forced a smile and said, "But you need to maintain a good relationship with the emperor. As for me, as long as the emperor does not obstruct me, not only do I want to have a good relationship with the military, but Wang Zhikuan and the other military elders also want to have a good relationship with me. If I take his daughter as a student, he will probably wake up laughing in the middle of the night." The great prince raised his brows. He knew that Fan Xian was speaking the truth. In the present Qing kingdom, purely in terms of power and status, there was no one more glorious than Fan Xian. Additionally, everyone knew that he was the flesh and blood of the Qing emperor and the mistress of the Yi family. With this connection, all of the officials and generals would unconsciously curry favor with him. After the 2 of them finished speaking, they fell silent at the same time. The great prince thought helplessly that it looked like the matter of taking a secondary fei would be difficult to resolve. Fan Xian was thinking, when exactly would the suspicion the emperor had toward him in the depths of his heart be dispelled? Tell me about the matter in the West. The great prince suddenly furrowed his brows and said seriously, "What exactly is going on with the Hu people? There has to be a reason for their great increase in power these 2 years. You'll know when the imperial bulletin comes out in a few days." Fan Xian had long known that the great prince would be unable to resist asking this question. The great prince had fought in the West for many years and was very familiar with the grasslands. He had killed the Hu people until their cries shook the heavens. If the emperor had not been worried that his eldest son's service was too great and could no longer be conferred a title, he would not have moved him back 3 years ago. Although the great prince had long returned to the capital, his heart often floated to the grasslands. He was very concerned about the situation there. The great prince saw that he was not willing to answer and shook his head helplessly. Hongqing has become more and more promising these 2 years. However, the Hu people are ruthless and bloodthirsty. You have to remind him more. After Fan Xian nodded, he suddenly furrowed his brows and asked seriously, "The Qing kingdom and the Western who have fought for decades. Each time, it looks like we have a great advantage and are about to completely resolve the problem. Why is it that each time, the Hu people's power is like wild grass after the spring breeze and grows again?" The great prince had a lot of right to speak on this question. That is because the grasslands are too big. Going west from the southern edge of the sky, there is no end to the grasslands. Once the Qing kingdom has the absolute advantage, they will flee west. How can we completely resolve the problem? This time, I found that the Western Hu court is not particularly far from Dingzhou, Fan Xian asked with confusion. The great prince glanced at him with slight mockery and said, the Hu people's court is not Jingdou or Shangjing. By the time we attacked there, they had long moved into the depths of the grasslands. It is only because the Hu people are powerful that they dare to move the court not far from the border. Putting aside the years I fought against the Hu people in the west, just talking about 20 years ago, Father personally led the army of the entire country to the grasslands with the intention of wiping out the Hu people in one fell swoop. Unfortunately, in the end it was all for naught, the great prince said with some regret. The power of the entire country, the imperial army personally attacking, and Father's genius military ability were still unable to subdue the Hu people in one fell swoop, much less people like us. When Fan Xian heard that the Qing emperor had personally led the imperial army on an expedition 20 years ago, his expression became serious. He didn't reply because he remembered clearly that during that western expedition his father, Fan Jian, had also followed in the camp. During that time, a shocking change had happened in Jingdou. This change ended a woman's life and gave him a second life. In the arms of the blind uncle, he sat in the carriage and went to Danzhou. The great prince did not notice Fan Xian's strange expression. Slowly he said, at that time the old chief had just passed away and the Hu people were in internal strife. It was the best opportunity for the Qing kingdom. It was truly a pity. What is most puzzling is that at that time, Commander Yi had handed over the Jingdou garrison by imperial edict and personally became the vanguard of the army. The elite cavalry had already followed the Western Hu court. As long as Father's camp could hold out for another 3 days, they would have been able to capture all of the Western Hu nobles in one fell swoop. However, at this time, the army suddenly stopped advancing westward and turned to retreat into the borders of the country, leaving the Western Hu people with a breath. Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He then raised his face and smiled slightly at the great prince. The reason for the army's retreat is very simple. Presumably at that time, the emperor already knew of my mother's death. The great prince's heart trembled. Only now did he think of the important matter that had been sealed away for many years. Looking at Fan Xian's forced smile, the great prince's pity rose in his heart and he did not continue this topic. A moment later, the great prince coughed and changed the topic back to the beginning. Is taking a secondary fey really not to be stopped? No one dares to disobey the edict. All those who oppose the emperor have not had a good end. Is Wang Tong really a good choice? At least I can't see a better choice right now. Then, how do I tell Wang Fei? Fan Xian laughed and said, you don't need to worry about this problem. Wang Fei has a way to deal with a little girl. As he spoke, someone outside announced that Wang Fei and young lady Wang had arrived. The great prince and Fan Xian met each other's eyes and both smiled bitterly. After the two women entered, Fan Xian stood and bowed. Without anyone noticing, he observed the expressions on their faces and nodded his head in his heart. Wang Fei was as calm and graceful as usual, but Wang Tonger's face was slightly red and shy. It was completely different from her earlier appearance. It looked like after Fan Xian had rushed her to Wang Fei's side, this young lady had received some kind of promise. Fan Xian sighed quietly in his heart. He knew Wang Fei was indeed powerful. She had long made up her mind before these two men, had decided. In order to protect her own interests, she had been forced to make a seemingly compromising choice. It looked like he wouldn't need to make things difficult for Wang Fei to persuade her in a moment. Instead, it would be Wang Fei persuading him to think of the big picture and not go against his father's wishes in the palace. Fan Xian smiled and looked at Wang Fei with narrowed eyes. Faintly he said a few words. Wang Fei also smiled. The two of them knew exactly what the other was thinking. During the Jingdou rebellion, the northern Qi emperor wanted the great prince to take the throne. Through the brocade guard spies he had sent to Wang Fei's side, he had secretly revealed Fan Xian's whereabouts to the eldest princess and almost caused Fan Xian's death. Fan Xian knew that this matter did not have much to do with Wang Fei. For the sake of the relationship between the great prince and his wife, he had never told the great prince about this matter. However, he and Wang Fei still had a knot in their hearts. Thus, during these 2 years they had not had much contact. Wang Fei had always felt guilty toward Fan Xian. It was not until now, when the two of them looked at each other and smiled like foxes, that the past melted like a spring breeze and disappeared without a trace. After chatting for a bit, Fan Xian rose to say his goodbyes. He had brought the young lady of the Wang family into the manor. Of course he had to take her out. After all, the palace had not appointed a marriage. No matter how open the Qing people were, if he allowed Wang Tonger, a love-struck fool, To wink at the great prince, it would be too unsightly if it got out. Wang Fei pretended to ask him to stay, but a clear light flashed through her eyes. Wang Tong, foolishly did not want to leave. She looked pitifully at Fan Xian. "Let's go," Fan Xian said. "Teacher, where are we going?" Wang Tong raised her head and looked at him in surprise. Wang Tong's eyes were filled with anger and refused to speak. Fan Xian's face immediately darkened. For some reason Wang Tong was innately afraid of Sir Fan Jr. She unconsciously stood up and gritted her teeth as she followed Fan Xian out of the manor. Walking along the way, Fan Xian had long seen the light in Wang Fei's eyes. Looking at Wang Tong beside him, he couldn't help but shake his head. Although this young lady was unruly, if she truly entered the manor, she would not be Wang Fei's match. She probably would not have many good days in the future. Fortunately, Wang Tong's background was powerful enough. Presumably, her life would not be too wretched. His Highness was also not that kind of person. In a moment, the two of them arrived at the front door of the manor. Fan Xian didn't know what magic he used to say to this unruly woman. Wang Tong seemed to have completely changed. She obediently and timidly followed behind him. There was no trace of her earlier appearance of stepping on the stone lion and cursing loudly. The front door of the manor opened. The housekeeper escorted them out and then quickly closed the door like he was hiding from a ghost. Fan Xian smiled and scolded, thinking that he had also been caught in the crossfire. In the blink of an eye, he saw Wang Tong's face full of anger and was about to curse the housekeeper. His face darkened and he made a sound of acknowledgement. Wang Tong immediately felt the coldness beside her and shivered. She quickly closed her mouth and obediently walked down the steps. With unusual discomfort, she said a few things to the old housekeeper with the whip marks on his face. The old housekeeper was frightened. When did his young lady's personality change? To the side, the Wang and Shi family soldiers were also scared silly. They wondered if Sir Fan Jr., who was rumored to be Sir Fei Jie's student, had given the young lady some medicine to make her like this? Wang Tong was like a little white rabbit. Everyone at the front of the manor looked at Fan Xian like they were looking at a god. They thought Sir Fan Jr. truly lived up to his reputation. No wonder the emperor had him pretend to be a tutor a few years ago to teach the third prince. This kind of teaching and educating methods was truly wondrous. The Wang family soldiers and housekeepers bowed to Fan Xian with endless gratitude. They then led their young lady out of the manor's front door. Fan Xian watched the group of people disappear into the street. He then shook his head and climbed into his carriage. Although Mu Feng was now the leader of the Qinian unit in his bones, he was still that meddlesome young man from the past. He swallowed and carefully asked, "Sir, what happened? That mother, how did she become like this?" "It's simple." Fan Xian sat in the carriage and closed his eyes to rest. "If she doesn't listen, I'll spank her. I'll have the king marry another woman. I am an official of Taichang Temple. How could she not believe me? That's stupid." Mu Feng said with disdain. Everyone knew that this matter related to the great prince taking a fei was not something an official of Taichang Temple could decide. This matter had to be approved by the emperor. If she wasn't stupid, why would the princess allow her to enter the manor? Fan Xian closed his eyes and muttered. He felt incredibly tired. He didn't want to get involved in this kind of thing again. If it weren't for his good relationship with the great prince, he would have gone to the palace long ago to complete his mission and then returned to his manor to play with his children. An hour passed and there was still no movement in the imperial study. The eunuch stood helplessly outside the room. Eunuch Yao glanced at the goat milk and pastries that the person beside him was holding. He found that the food was almost cold and couldn't help but furrow his brows. The young eunuch looked at the door of the imperial study and wondered who His Majesty was talking to for such a long time. Eunuch Yao also glanced at the door and thought it would be best if he did not disturb the father and son talking. Other than the young eunuch who had just arrived, no one else was surprised by the current situation. The emperor had a myriad of affairs to attend to and rarely summoned an official alone for more than a quarter of an hour. Sir Fan Jr. was an exception. During these 2 years, each time Sir Fan Jr. entered the palace, the emperor would always chat with him for half an hour in the imperial study. It was not limited to matters of state and council. A few times, Eunuch Yao had even heard the emperor and Fan Xian argue about the names of the Fan family's 2 children. There was only Fan Xian in the entire world who had such an honor and such favor. The situation in the imperial study was different from what the eunuchs thought. The Qing emperor looked at Fan Xian sitting to his right and said, "I have already decided. Wang Tong will eventually enter the manor. Don't meddle in other people's business." Speaking of marriage, a few days ago Yan Bingyun married that woman. When are you going to explain the matter of Zhaoshang Money House to me? Fan Xian's expression changed slightly. He quickly lowered his head to hide it. Chapter 617. Before I wrote, I looked and found that Wang Tong'er's Sun character showed a different form. Perhaps it was too skewed. Sun means beautiful. Now it looks like it needs to be changed to Tong. Also, I want to report something to everyone. I am seriously reserving monthly tickets after the 28th because I want to enter the top 3. I clenched my fist and spoke in a low and forceful voice. Fan Xian had been in the royal study for a long time. In the beginning he picked the most important things to talk about. Presently what the Qing kingdom cared about the most was the situation in Shiliang Road and to what extent the plan the emperor had the Overwatch Council prepare 4 months ago had been carried out. Fan Xian spoke confidently and with assurance. The emperor listened quietly. There was not a trace of dissatisfaction on his face. He even said a few rare words of comfort to Fan Xian, saying that he had worked hard. Feeling that the environment was suitable and the timing was just right, Fan Xian's eyes spun. He took this opportunity to say a few idle words about the great prince taking a secondary fey. The gist of this idle talk was completely different from the response he had discussed with the great prince in the manor. He directly used words to humiliate the young lady of the Wang family. At the same time, he expressed his strong desire as an official not to participate in the affairs of the royal family. Just as Fan Xian had expected, the emperor flew into a rage upon hearing these words. He reprimanded Fan Xian, pointed out his identity as an official of Taichang Temple, and said harsh words about the matter of the prince taking a secondary fey. This storm did not make Fan Xian feel any fear. He had been with this unfathomable emperor for a long time. Although he was still unable to see into the depths of his heart, at least he had a clear understanding of his personality and likes. However, such a vigorous scolding often meant that the matter was not serious. As expected, Fan Xian took the opportunity to suggest that since he was an official of Taichang Temple and the emperor was going to marry the young lady of the Wang family to the great prince, he had to think for the sake of the royal family's face. Should he teach the young lady some things? These things were usually done by the old nannies in the palace, yet Fan Xian, a young man, had stolen them. It was unavoidably comical. However, the emperor did not laugh. He directly told Fan Xian not to meddle in other people's business, but he did not get angry. The emperor had probably long known of the story outside the manor and had long guessed why his favorite son had insisted on not allowing it earlier and what benefits he had asked for. Just as Fan Xian felt slightly more at ease, he heard the words, Zhaoshang Money House. These 4 words were like a deep brand, burning his heart, causing him to lower his head and remain silent for a moment. He knew why the emperor had chosen this moment to have him hand over Zhaoshang Money House. It was because he had gotten used to this kind of sudden thunder over the past 2 years. If it weren't for his thick skin, he would have been struck by lightning in the past 2 years. Was this the so-called unfathomable saint's heart? Fan Xian thought to himself that although the emperor doted on him to the extreme and allowed him to be free and arrogant in the Qing court, he still did not forget to give him a warning from time to time. Yes, this was what a king would do to the person closest to him. He wanted to wake him up so that he wouldn't get carried away and ruin the relationship between a king and his subject or a father and son. Ever since the Jingdo rebellion, each time Fan Xian had performed a great service for the court or been heavily rewarded by the emperor would always lightly throw out some things or names to frighten Fan Xian and make him understand the position he was in. The stick the emperor used to beat Fan Xian with in court was He Zongwei and his group of officials. The real thunder that he struck in private was the things Fan Xian had done in secret. Counting carefully, the things that had served as the emperor's thunder these 2 years included the details of Xia Mingji, Xia Qifei's relationship with the Jiangnan water bandits, Fan Xijia's smuggling in the north, the first thunder about Su Maocai's impure intentions, why 13th Wang had sought refuge with Fan Xian, and so on and so forth. Each thunder struck directly into Fan Xian's heart and made his entire body cold. He didn't seem to have any secrets in front of the emperor. If these crimes were truly brought out, they would all result in beheading. He knew the emperor would not bear to use these crimes against him. He was only reminding him. Even so, his entire body was still cold. He felt that the Grandmaster Emperor on the dragon couch could swallow him with a casual breath. Fortunately, Fan Xian was not a normal official. Faced with the emperor's thunder, his way of dealing with it was also unique. He could only rely on his thick skin. He would admit to the crimes that he had to admit to, but he would continue to do what he had to do. In any case, the emperor didn't want to kill him, so he would continue to muddle along like this. However, he couldn't muddle along anymore. Zhaoshang Money House was too important to Fan Xian. Regardless of whether it was the Overwatch Council's expenses, the silver moved to the Yangtze River to repair the embankments, the Hangzhou conference that Wan'er hosted, or even the luxurious lifestyle of the entire clan in Qin Garden, they all came from Zhaoshang Money House. Most importantly, Zhaoshang Money House had once hidden millions of liang of silver from the northern Qi emperor. Once it was known, this crime of betraying the country could not be hidden no matter how Fan Xian pretended to be a filial son and wailed. A few lines of cold sweat rolled down his back. 3 years ago, when he had subdued the old man of the Ming family who was not afraid of boiling water, Zhaoshang Money House had been forced to walk onto the stage. He had guessed that this matter would certainly arouse the emperor's suspicions. The Ministry of Revenue had not moved this much silver. The emperor would certainly wonder where the silver in the money house came from. Fan Xian had made a lot of preparations for this secret. He confirmed that he had already cleaned up the accounts in the north. In the past, the emperor had also asked about the source of Zhaoshang Money House's money. At that time, Fan Xian had used the most famous rumor in the world to brush it off. Everyone thought that the mysterious shares in Zhaoshang Money House were the secret wealth that the commander of the Northern Qi Brocade Guards, Shen Zhong, had saved up after decades of operation. Now the emperor had asked directly. Furthermore, he had mentioned the young lady of the Shen family, who had been married to Yan Bingyun for less than 3 months. He was warning Fan Xian that the young lady of the Shen family had always been under his control, but she had also always been in the emperor's eyes. Don't use the Shen family's inheritance as a bluff again. 2 more lines of cold sweat appeared on Fan Xian's back. However, it was already late autumn and the beginning of winter. Although there was a fire burning in the royal study, it was still cold. The official robes he wore were thick. For a moment it was impossible to tell. His expression remained valiantly calm. "Your Majesty, what do you want to explain?" The emperor's expression darkened. He was very displeased that this kid still wanted to bluff his way out of such a private conversation. He had no idea that Fan Xian's heart was beating like a drum. He wondered if the little emperor in the north held a grudge against him for wantonly killing northern Qi spies in Shiliang Road and thus tossed out this secret agreement and used the Qing emperor's hand to kill him. Did northern Qi hate him that much? Were they willing to pay such a high price to get rid of him? Fan Xian's expression could no longer maintain its calm. Sweat beaded slightly on his forehead. He thought, since that little strange creature from northern Qi dared to toss out knives, who knew if he dared to toss out the money house? Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the clear displeasure on the emperor's face. Seeing this displeasure, Fan Xian was overjoyed. If the emperor truly knew the inside story of this matter and wanted to take him down, given his shrewdness and cultivation, how could he be so sincerely displeased? Fan Xian smiled awkwardly and coughed dryly. He then said, "The silver at the beginning of Zhaoshang Money House was indeed not the Shen family's treasure. It was my own private stash." This answer was very clever. If a normal official had heard these words, they would certainly have cursed Fan Xian for being shameless and disgusting. Zhaoshang Money House had millions of liang of silver as its foundation. Whose private stash could be that much? However, when the emperor heard these words, he clearly revealed an expression as if he knew everything. Faintly he said, "As expected. When did Lao Wu give this money to you?" Fan Xian laughed bitterly and replied respectfully, "It was only before I went to Jiangnan that Uncle Wu Zhu knew I needed money." The emperor looked at him and shook his head. Lao Wu is also messing around. Why would he give such a large sum of silver to a child like you? Fan Xian let out a big breath in his heart. He knew that the emperor was, as he had expected, thinking of the old Yi family. However, there was still a strange smile on his face. It was as if he was silently criticizing the emperor for coveting this money. It was also as if he was silently criticizing the emperor for helping him earn millions of liang of silver after he took over the Jiangnan Palace treasury, yet he was still not satisfied. The emperor clearly saw what Fan Xian's expression was hiding. He angrily scolded him in a low voice. A moment later, he forcefully suppressed his anger and pretended to be unintentional. "This palace treasury was left behind by your mother. Do you think I care about those millions of liang of silver? However, don't spend the silver your mother left you carelessly." Fan Xian did not dare to be negligent. He quickly explained each and every use of Zhaoshang Money House's money. The emperor knew these things very well, but it was always better to explain them clearly one by one. Furthermore, now that he had made it clear, he couldn't bring up old debts in the future. The emperor stroked his beard with satisfaction and nodded his head. Of course it is good to use it for good deeds. Chen-er is also someone who can do things. Don't always lock her up in the manor. When she has nothing to do, let her enter the palace to keep me company. Fan Xian thought to himself that he had never locked up his lovely wife. Presently, she was busy managing the affairs of the entire Fan family. Additionally, because of the Jingdo rebellion, it was inevitable that she would develop some conflicting feelings toward her uncle, the emperor. She did not want to enter the palace. Take good care of the matters in the west. The emperor stood and suddenly thought of something. Pretending to be unintentional, he asked, "Where did Lao Wu go?" "I don't know where he went." Fan Xian also quickly stood and said, "I saw him once 2 years ago. This kid always likes to disappear. How did he learn the same temper as Uncle Yi?" The emperor said with a headache. He then waved his hand indicating for Fan Xian to leave. The door to the royal study was finally pushed open. Fan Xian walked out with a calm expression. Seeing Eunuch Yao waiting to the side, he nodded his head in greeting. Eunuch Yao quickly lowered his body and bowed. Lowering his voice, he asked, "How is your majesty's mood?" Fan Xian smiled. The dark clouds on his face quickly turned into a patch of sunlight. It was incomparably brilliant, but his mood was heavy. Every time he entered the palace to see the emperor, it was a day of suffering for him. The omnipresent pressure and the sense of authority of an emperor and grandmaster made him very uncomfortable. Particularly, he had to occasionally endure a lightning strike like the one he had today. It was truly unpleasant. When the emperor asked about Wu Zhu's whereabouts at the end, Fan Xian couldn't help but mock coldly in his heart. Of the 2 foreign great grandmasters, one was dead and the other was crippled. Yi Liuyun's existence was clearly not necessary for the Qing kingdom. This figure, whose nature was like that of a wild crane or a leisurely cloud, had truly floated far away after helping the Qing emperor complete the situation at Dong Mountain. It was impossible for him to appear again. Although the emperor had acted naturally when he asked about Wu Zhu, Fan Xian knew that the emperor had always been secretly cautious and on guard toward Uncle Wu Zhu. As for why it was like this, Fan Xian knew very well. Walking along the long eaves of Taiji Palace toward the lofty royal palace, his expression gradually calmed. Private conversations like this in the royal study had occurred many times. From the discomfort he had felt when he first faced the lightning to how he handled it now, Fan Xian had grown a great deal. Standing under the lofty Taiji Palace and looking at the stone steps carved with dragon clouds, Fan Xian took a deep breath and let the cold early winter air quickly enter his chest. The icy coldness was incomparably comfortable. The things the emperor knew were things Fan Xian was not afraid of letting him know. Although the lightning strikes were terrifying, they could not shatter the hard outer shell in Fan Xian's heart. He still had many secrets that he had successfully kept from the emperor, such as Zhaoshang Money House, the death of a few shopkeepers in Qingyu Hall, Uncle Wu Zhu's true whereabouts, and a small workshop slowly taking shape in a small country controlled by Dongyi. For example, he knew that there was a soul in his body that did not belong to this world. For example, he knew how a similar soul had appeared in this world in a moving manner and disappeared in this world in a heart-wrenching manner. These were all things that the omnipotent Qing emperor did not know. These were Fan Xian's trump cards. The emperor also did not know that his 2 greatest cards, the chest and Uncle Wu Zhu, had already left him and had gone somewhere unknown. His eyes narrowed as he looked at the sturdy royal palace across the long imperial road. His gaze went past the city walls and straight through the cold clouds in the sky. But very few people were like the owner of the medical shop opposite Dambo bookstore, who had such complicated feelings toward him. The medical shop had just been bought and had not yet opened for business. The medicine seemed to be piled up in a messy but orderly fashion. A girl wearing a plain-colored brocade robe was supporting her chin in a daze in the room filled with the smell of medicine. She did not notice that there were already too many random people gathered outside the medical shop. If it weren't for the manor guards and secret Overwatch Council agents blocking them, those people would probably have long squeezed into the medical shop. Master Ku He's last disciple, the young lady of the Fan family with astonishing medical skills, and Sir Fan Jr.'s favorite sister had finally left Qing Mountain and returned to her hometown of Jingdo. Under the surprised gazes of the Jingdo people and the room filled with the strange smell of medicine, she began to miss certain people. Chapter 618. Fan Xian sat in the carriage and thought of the news Teng Zijing had just reported at the palace gates. He felt a bit anxious. If he had known earlier that his sister had returned to Jingdo earlier, he would not have cared about the prince taking on a secondary fei. There was no sound in the royal study. He had long rushed toward the Dambo bookstore. 3 months ago he had received Ruoruo's letter from Northern Qi. Knowing that she could finally leave Qing Mountain and return home, Fan Xian was naturally happy. Following the instructions in his sister's letter, he had carefully choose a good location for a medical shop for her in Jingdo. Unexpectedly, after Wanner's picking and choosing, she finally chose the one across from the Dambo bookstore not far from the Imperial College. Fan Xian thought this was not bad. The 3 siblings could be considered neighbors on the street. He had not expected that Ruoruo would return earlier than the letter had said. Furthermore, according to Teng Zijing, she had only stayed in the manor for a short time before rushing excitedly to the location of the medical shop. During these 2 years, Fan Ruoruo, as Master Kuhi's last disciple, managed all the chores on Qing Mountain. As a Qing person, in addition to being Fan Xian's sister, although she had the silent permission of the Northern Qi royal family and the support of Lang Tiao, it was still difficult for her. Other than managing the mountain gate, Fan Ruoruo would often go down the mountain to treat illnesses for the poor people of Northern Qi. Her fees were cheap, and her medical skills were brilliant. Additionally, she had a great reputation. Before long, all of Northern Qi knew that a kind-hearted and merciful doctor had appeared in the Tianyi Dao sect. After receiving a long period of instruction from her brother, this talented girl in Jingdo finally found her life's goal. Once she found it, she became very persistent. Otherwise, she wouldn't have stopped at home as soon as she returned to Jingdo to keep an eye on the progress of the medical shop. Fan Xian rubbed the spot between his brows curiously, wondering whether his sister had become Hua Bianc or Feng Hua. This was the question he had been most worried about in the past. Today Dongchuan Road was packed with people and was bustling with noise and excitement. Although it wasn't a festival, there were countless people who came to watch the fun. Those who didn't know the inside story would probably think that there was a juggler performing inside. Dongchuan Road was close to the Imperial College. Most of the onlookers were young students of the Imperial College. They stood on their tiptoes and stretched their necks to look inside, hoping to catch a glimpse of the once famous young lady of the Fan family in the capital and see what she looked like. 4 or 5 years had passed. Of the famous talents in Jingdo, one He Zongwei had already entered the court as an official and was extremely popular for a time. The other, Ho Jichang, was far away in Jiaozhou and had almost been forgotten. As for the most famous young ladies in Jingdo, Yi Linger had fled far away to Qingzhou, and Lin Wanner had married, so they could no longer be the topic of discussion at the tea table. Presently, the most popular topic in gossip circles was the barbarism of the young lady of the Wang family, the cowardice of the young lady of the He family, and the arrogance of the distant relatives of the royal family in the Imperial College. To quote a comment that Fan Xian had once plagiarized, "Each generation is worse than the previous." But Fan Ruoruo was an exception. Back then, she had been famous in Jingdo for her talent in poetry. Later, she had gained the favor of the Imperial College and entered Kuhi's school. She had obtained a good reputation in Northern Qi. How could the people of her hometown forget her? At noon, she had just appeared in the medical shop when she was recognized by a teacher of the Imperial College. From 1 to 10, from 10 to 100, it had become the most sensational news in Jingdo. Fan Xian lifted the curtain of the carriage window and furrowed his brows. He looked angrily at the young scholars blocking the entrance to his bookstore and the medical shop that did not have a signboard. He thought to himself that these people were too impetuous, and his face showed some displeasure. Seeing his expression, Mu Fenger said in a low and cold voice, "I will immediately chase these people away." Fan Xian did not comment. Teng Zijing quietly said, "I will go clear the area." Only then did Fan Xian nod his head. These years he had, with great difficulty, maintained his position in the hearts of scholars and successfully washed away much of the Overwatch Council's dark colors. How could he bear to let Mu Fenger corrupt it? No one knew what Teng Zijing said after he got off the carriage, but the pedestrians and scholars blocking Dongchuan Road immediately dispersed, emptying out a large space at the end of the street. However, when those scholars passed by the black carriage, they all respectfully saluted the carriage, and only then did they silently retreat. It looked like these people knew the identity of the person in the carriage, so they did not dare to slight him, particularly since the scholars already saw Fan Xian as their idol. Additionally, Fan Xian was also a professor at the Imperial College. How could they dare to linger? To be able to make a scholar bow to him proved that Fan Xian was not as simple as a noble. Dongchuan Road quieted down. Fan Xian got off the carriage and suppressed the excitement in his heart. Smiling slightly, he walked into the medical shop across from the bookstore. He didn't have time to see how Warner had cleaned up the place. His gaze glanced directly in. Unexpectedly, he did not see Ruoruo's face. He only saw the flimsy brocade robe and her slightly thin waist. Fan Ruoruo did not notice the change outside the medical shop. She had long shaken off her absent-mindedness and was crouching in the inner room organizing the herbs. She had also brought back some rare and precious herbs from Qing Mountain in northern Qi. She was thinking about how to store them. Hearing the sound of footsteps coming from behind her, Fan Ruoruo did not rise. Straightforwardly she said, "It's not open yet. If it's not an emergency, please come back in a few days." Hearing this voice, Fan Xian was happy. Adding to the fact that these words contained the heart of a doctor, it made him involuntarily smile with satisfaction. Standing behind her, he said, "If it was really an illness, how could I wait for you to come back and treat it? Perhaps my own medical skills are lacking?" Hearing this familiar yet somewhat strange voice, Fan Ruoruo's body trembled slightly. She immediately recovered her calm and stood up. With her back to Fan Xian, she tidied her clothes. Slowly turning her head, she bowed down and said, "Brother is here." Although she was purposely suppressing her emotions, the brows on her face, the look in her eyes, and the curve of the corners of her lips all revealed the joy in her heart. Looking at the joy on Ruoruo's sister's face, Fan Xian's heart felt an inexplicable pain. He did not understand why and could not make head or tail of it. He stared at his sister in a daze. He looked at this familiar face that he had not seen in many years. He looked at the familiar sense of ice and snow between her brows. It turned into a faint glow in front of him. He gently sighed. Then he took a step forward and gently touched his sister's head. Ruoruo lowered her head slightly and habitually tilted her head. Just like in the spring of the 4th year of the Qing calendar, when Fan Xian had first come to Jingdo and entered Count Sinan's manor, the long-separated brother and sister only needed a few words and a small action to dispel the sense of unfamiliarity created by time. They once again returned to the situation of the active monkey and the sickly little monkey from many years ago. They returned to the bits and pieces of conversation about flying geese from all over the world. Fan Xian found a chest and sat down. Looking at his sister, who was still busy, he said, "How did you get here so early? Didn't you also come back early?" Fan Ruoruo replied with a smile. She raised her arm and pressed her sweaty temples together. "There were no delays on the road, so I got here a few days early. You traveled thousands of li south. You didn't stay at home and rest for a few days. The matters of the medical shop will be arranged by your sister-in-law. You just have to ask questions and don't worry about this." Fan Xian glanced at her disapprovingly. He found that although his sister was still thin, she appeared to be in much better spirits. Perhaps it was because she had often practiced medicine in the remote countryside these 2 years. Her skin had also darkened a bit. Even the layer of ice that was commonly seen between her brows had gradually disappeared. Although they often wrote to each other, it was never as thorough as when she was by his side. Fan Xian felt a bit of self-blame in his heart. When she had escaped marriage and left the country, it had all been arranged by him. Looking at his sister, he sighed. He didn't know how she had been these 2 years. The servants in the manor have changed a few times. I don't know a single person. I didn't even have someone to talk to. I sat in the flower hall for a while and thought about coming to the bookstore to take a look. I didn't know that the place you picked was right across from the medical shop. Fan Ruoruo very naturally pulled her brother up to prevent him from damaging the chest she kept the medicine in and said, "If you sit on this medicine, how can it be used by others? Who am I? I am the immortal of poetry. If this gets out, I'm afraid people will pick this chest of medicine to buy." Fan Xian told a very cold joke and then asked in surprise, "Where's your sister-in-law?" "Where's Cece?" Minister Fan took Lady Lu back to Danzhou to retire and took away half of the servants in the old manor. Additionally, the manor needed people and the servants had to be betrothed. In just a few years, the entire Fan manor had become somewhat unfamiliar to Fan Ruoruo. Fan Xian acutely noticed this. He thought to himself that even Si Xiang, that sleepy girl, had now properly become the wife of a county magistrate. In a few years, Jingdo had changed too much. It was best if Ruoruo didn't get used to it. Sister-in-law and Cece took Teng Zijing to the country estate. Fan Ruoruo glanced at him curiously as if she didn't understand why her brother had asked such a stupid question. "I just entered the city with Teng Zijing today. Of course I didn't run into them. All large families had their own country estates and mountain businesses outside of Jingdo, much less a large family like the Fan clan. In the past, Fan Xian often played in these estates. For a moment he had not thought that it would be winter. It should be time to prepare for the end of the year. Wanner and Cici, who were in charge of the Fan clan's businesses, were extremely busy. He rubbed the space between his brows with a headache and said, "Your return is a major event. No matter how busy you were, you should have waited in the manor." Fan Roro glanced at him and said without good humor, "You and I both came back 3 days early. Who would have the divine foresight?" Fan Xian patted his butt and rose. His brows raised in delight. "I could at least calculate that you should be hungry right now." The front and back manors of the Fan Manor had long been connected. The garden had also been changed. Even the people living inside were different. Fan Xian was still used to living with Wanner and Cici in the new manor. His father's old manor was empty. A servant woman had long cleaned up Ruoro's old room. It was as clean as before. Fan Ruoro followed Fan Xian through the door and thought of the dozen years she had spent in Jingdo. The rims of her eyes reddened. Fan Xian could not bear to see a woman cry, except of course for his dead mother-in-law. He hurriedly took Ruoro to the flower hall. There was no one else in the manor. The brother and sister sat facing each other, toasting each other with wine, stuffing themselves with food and talking about their lives after they had parted. However, when they talked about the Jingdo rebellion, Ruoro was incomparably worried. When they talked about the loneliness on Qing Mountain and the gazes of the northern Qi people, Fan Xian's eyes became angry. "How is my brother doing over there?" Fan Xian put down his wine cup and asked. Fan Xizha had been dealing with the businesses in the north. Although the two of them had always exchanged letters and shared information, he still asked out of habit. From his sister's words, Fan Xian knew that Xizha's life in the north had been difficult. Although the northern Qi royal family had not done anything on the surface, they had secretly played some unremarkable tricks. Fan Xian thought deeply for a moment and then said, "An uncut jade is worthless. The northern Qi emperor will not truly turn hostile for a while. Let him stay over there." During these 2 years, Fan Xizha had returned to Jingdo twice. He had also spent the spring festival in the 9th year of the Qing calendar in Danzhou. However, the Fan family had been forced to be far apart. It was difficult to gather together. Every time he thought of this, Fan Xian felt very unhappy. The problem was that the emperor could not allow him to resign at such a tense time. His father should not stay in Jingdo. Staying in Danzhou to take care of grandmother was better than constantly worrying about an unfortunate end. Fan Ruoro nodded. She did not have a sliver of doubt in her heart toward her brother's words. Regardless of whether it was her brother or herself, it was only under her brother's arrangements that they truly had a completely different life from that of other nobles. It was the most fulfilling kind. "I'll rest today and talk properly tomorrow. Lao Wang is not here. There are many things I want to say to someone but have nowhere to go." Fan Xian mumbled a few inarticulate words, venting his rare gloominess. In this world, other than Lin Debao and Wang Qinian, Uncle Wu Zhu and his sister, who had been greatly influenced by him, were the most suitable people to talk to. Fan Xian even dared to say treasonous things to these 4 people. The problem was that Debao was too naive and did not know how to say, "and then." Wang Qinian had run away, Uncle Wu Zhu had escaped, and his sister was not here. Yet she had finally returned. This kind of feeling was very good. It was difficult for Fan Xian to suppress the joy in his heart. He didn't know how much wine he had drunk, but he did not want to take the antidote. Taking advantage of his drunkenness, he lay on the table and fell asleep. Fan Ruoro looked at her brother, who reeked of alcohol, and shook her head helplessly. She ordered the servants to carry him back to his room and personally covered him with a blanket. She tidied his long black hair and carefully took out a few needles from his hair, just like a few years ago when Fan Xian had been injured before his wedding. Returning to her own room, Fan Ruoro looked at the thin needles in her hand that shone with all kinds of light and couldn't resist smiling slightly. She thought to herself that her sister-in-law should also know about these poisonous needles. Was she not afraid that something would go wrong when they were intimate? Or did she have to clean them up every night? She immediately realized that she shouldn't have thought about this question. She secretly blushed and quickly put the needles back into the box. Fan Xian's final life-saving trick had been personally made by the two of them in the back courtyard. Naturally, she knew how to deal with it. The house was old, the bedding was new, the people were old, and the things in their hearts were also old. Fan Ruoro sat quietly by the table and looked out the window at the garden outside. She thought of her brother's drunken and happy appearance earlier and was a little lost in thought. From their conversation, she knew that although her brother had been living happily in the capital these years, there was always an indescribable pressure that made it difficult for him to be happy. She sighed and put on a jacket. She walked out of the room and strolled in the garden under the old moonlight. In the room behind her, the flickering candlelight was looking for a shadow and telling it how bright its dreams were. It was the same moonlight as before, but somehow it made her more and more flustered. But Fan Ruoruo clearly knew that all of this was just an illusion. Regardless of whether or not her thoughts could be accepted in this world, the most important thing was that from many years ago, her brother had habitually taken care of her like a child. In Guxian's arms she had never had such thoughts. She couldn't help but smile bitterly and helplessly. She thought to herself that she should quickly open the medical shop. There were still so many pitiful people in the world who needed her help. Why should she think of these childish thoughts that were difficult to express in the early winter? Once she thought of these matters, the moonlight that fell on her delicate face seemed to become calm. Years of living in the north had made this girl's temperament undergo a great change. There was no longer that indifference in her calmness. Instead, there was a sense of calmness that could take and let go. Putting aside what kind of commotion the young lady of the Fan family's return to the capital had caused, the Fan manor had become much livelier. Lin Wanner, who had received the news, hurried back from the country estate. When sisters-in-law met, there was a sense of intimacy. Particularly when she saw her niece and nephew, Fan Ruoruo was endlessly happy. This happy and harmonious family was an anomaly in the Jingdo manor. However, this kind of atmosphere could not be maintained for long because Fan Ruoruo was in a hurry to open the medical shop. The palace also had Fan Xian bring Ruoruo into the palace to see the emperor. Naturally, there were people to handle the matters of the medical shop. Seeing the emperor only took a day. However, the young people of the second generation of the Fan manor could no longer be idle. Fan Ruoruo had studied in Qing Mountain for many years. This was her first time returning to the capital, so there were many elders and relatives she had to visit. The first stop was, without question, King Jing's manor, which had a good relationship with the Fan manor. In the past, this kind of visit was common. The problem was that Fan Ruoruo had almost become King Jing's daughter-in-law. Later, she had been sent by Fan Xian to northern Qi to study under Ku He. King Jing had always remembered this matter. Whenever he saw Fan Xian he would sigh and sigh. The situation between the two families was slightly awkward. When Fan Ruoruo knew she was going to the manor, she couldn't help but feel uneasy. What is there to be uneasy about? Fan Xian looked at his sister's expression and thought of Hongqing's suffering in Dingzhou. His heart trembled. He didn't know whether he had done the right thing or wrong thing in the past. Forcing a smile, he said, "During the new year, Hongqing will also return to the capital. Are you going to hide and not see him for the rest of your life?" You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.